The village of Upper Thistledown, nestled within the gently undulating folds of a landscape so consistently verdant and unremarkable it scarcely warranted a second glance from travelers hastening towards more consequential destinations, slumbered beneath the pale, indifferent eye of a late autumn sun, a sun whose warmth had long since dwindled to a feeble suggestion, barely sufficient to coax the lingering dew from the coarse thatch roofs or to animate the sluggish current of the river Rindle as it meandered, thick and brown like cold tea, past the squat stone mill and the dozen or so cottages that comprised the entirety of human habitation in this forgotten corner. Here, time itself seemed to have settled into a state of profound inertia, measured not by the frantic ticking of clocks, which were scarce and unreliable luxuries, but by the slow, inevitable decay of timber fences, the gradual subsidence of cottage walls, and the patient accumulation of moss upon every north-facing surface. It was within this atmosphere of profound stillness, broken only by the distant lowing of a cow or the occasional, half-hearted crow of a rooster seemingly unsure of the time, that Hubert Gableby commenced his day, a day indistinguishable in its essential components from the one preceding it and the one that would inevitably follow, by rising from his narrow, straw-stuffed pallet precisely as the first grey light began to seep through the small, thick-paned window of his single-room dwelling. The air within the cottage was chill and damp, carrying the lingering scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint, sour tang of yesterday's porridge clinging stubbornly to the iron pot hanging by the hearth. Hubert, a man whose physical presence seemed molded by the landscape itself, broad, solid, weathered by decades of exposure and toil into a state of permanent, unyielding sturdiness, moved with a deliberate slowness that bordered on the ceremonial, each action performed with a focused gravity as if the very stability of Upper Thistledown depended upon the meticulous execution of his morning routine. He pulled on thick woolen stockings, coarse trousers of durable fustian, a collarless shirt of rough-spun linen, and finally, a waistcoat of faded bottle green wool, its buttons straining slightly over his substantial frame, each garment donned in an unchanging sequence established decades prior. His movements were economical, devoid of flourish, each muscle engaging with the resigned efficiency of a well-maintained, albeit elderly, piece of agricultural machinery. Having thus armored himself against the day, Hubert turned his attention to the hearth, where a few stubborn embers from last night's fire still glowed faintly beneath the thick blanket of grey ash. Kneeling with a soft grunt that was more exhalation than complaint, he carefully teased these embers back to life, adding first the finest twigs, then progressively larger splinters of dry oak, and finally, 2 substantial logs, each selected weeks ago for the density and slow-burning properties, a process that consumed a full quarter of an hour and required intense concentration on the precise arrangement of fuel and the gentle coaxing of air with a worn leather bellows. Once a steady, comforting flame was established, its heat beginning, almost imperceptibly, to push back the cottage's chill, Hubert filled a heavy blackened kettle from a large earthenware pitcher and suspended it over the fire on a stout iron hook. The wait for the water to boil was a period of profound stillness. Hubert seated on a low, 3-legged stool, his large, work-roughened hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed unblinkingly on the growing plume of steam beginning to whisper from the kettle's spout, a contemplation so deep and devoid of apparent thought that it mirrored the stillness of the landscape beyond his door. The kettle's eventual whistle, when it came, was not a shrill shriek but a low, persistent hum, like a drowsy bee trapped against a windowpane, and Hubert responded with the same unhurried pace, measuring coarse ground oats into a smaller pot, adding a precise pinch of salt from a wooden bowl, and pouring the boiling water over them with a steady hand, stirring the mixture slowly with a wooden spoon worn smooth by decades of such stirring. The porridge bubbled thickly, releasing a cloud of steam that carried the bland, comforting aroma of hot grain into the room. While it cooked, Hubert retrieved a small, round loaf of bread from the larder cupboard, a loaf baked 3 days prior and now possessing the resilient density of seasoned timber. He sawed 2 thick slices from it with a bone-handled knife, the sound a rhythmic rasping that filled the quiet cottage, and placed them on the flat iron plate resting amidst the coals at the edge of the hearth to toast. The process of toasting was lengthy, requiring frequent turning to achieve an even, deep golden brown without charring, each turn executed with meticulous care. Finally, after perhaps 40 minutes had elapsed since rising, Hubert assembled his breakfast upon a heavy wooden trencher, a generous mound of steaming, glutinous porridge, the 2 slices of thoroughly toasted bread, and a small pat of pale yellow butter churned yesterday from the milk of his single, elderly cow, Daisy. He ate methodically, without haste or evident pleasure, each spoonful of porridge followed by a small bite of buttered toast, his jaws working with a slow, powerful rhythm, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the cottage wall, perhaps observing in his mind's eye the unchanging view of the field where his 2 sheep grazed, or the slow progress of clouds across the vast, empty sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the scrape of spoon on trencher, and the steady, deliberate mastication. This meal, like every action Hubert undertook, was not merely sustenance, but a reaffirmation of order, a ritual bulwark against the entropy that constantly threatened the fragile equilibrium of life in Upper Thistledown. Chapter 2. Once the trencher was scraped perfectly clean, the last smear of butter and every stray oat gathered with a final pass of his bread crust, Hubert placed the wooden dish and spoon into a shallow basin of cold water drawn earlier from the well. Washing up was a similarly deliberate affair, involving a sliver of hard, yellow soap that produced little lather but possessed a stringent, piney scent, and a coarse linen cloth for drying, each item rinsed and wiped with the same focused attention he gave to stacking firewood or mending a fence. The damp cloth was then draped precisely over the edge of the basin to dry, and the basin itself placed back on its designated shelf within the cool, shadowy recesses of the larder. Having thus restored the interior of the cottage to its baseline state of functional austerity, Hubert pulled on his heavy, hobnailed boots, lacing them tightly with thick leather thongs, shrugged into his thick, mud-spattered work jacket of durable moleskin, and finally, placed a shapeless felt hat upon his head, its broad brim shadowing his deeply lined face. Pushing open the stout oak door, he stepped out into the morning proper, the air crisp and carrying the distinct, damp earth smell of late autumn, mingled with wood smoke from neighboring chimneys and the faint, sweet sour scent of decaying leaves. The village lane, little more than a deeply rutted track hardened by centuries of use and the recent passage of a light overnight frost, stretched before him, empty save for a few foraging chickens scratching listlessly near Widow Cribben's gate. Hubert's destination was his small holding, a modest patch of land comprising a vegetable garden now mostly harvested save for a few hardy cabbages and leeks, a small orchard of ancient, gnarled apple trees whose fruit had long since been gathered and stored or pressed into cider, and a pasture where Daisy the cow and the 2 sheep, nameless entities referred to simply as the ewes, awaited their morning ration of hay. His first task was to attend to Daisy, a creature of immense patience and placid disposition whose large, liquid eyes regarded Hubert with a calm indifference as he approached the byre. The byre, a low structure of stone and timber adjoining his cottage, smelled richly of manure, hay, and warm animal. Hubert forked a generous portion of sweet-smelling hay from the loft into Daisy's manger, the dried grasses rustling with a sound like a slow sigh, then carefully brushed down her broad flank with a stiff bristled brush, removing loose hair and dried mud in long, rhythmic strokes that seemed to induce a state of profound contentment in the cow, her eyes half closing as she rhythmically chewed her cud. This grooming was not strictly necessary, but it was part of Hubert's unwavering routine, a silent communion between man and beast. Next, he lifted the heavy wooden milking stool into place, settled himself beside Daisy's warm bulk, placed the clean, dented pail beneath her udder, and commenced milking. His large hands, surprisingly deft at this task, worked with a practiced, unhurried rhythm, squeeze, release, the rich, warm milk striking the bottom of the pail with a steady, hypnotic ping, 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 that filled the quiet byre. The process took a considerable time, Daisy's full udder yielding a good 3 pints of frothy milk. Hubert carried the pail back to the cottage, the milk sloshing gently with each step, poured it through a fine muslin cloth into a large earthenware crock to settle, covered it with a weighted wooden lid to deter flies, though flies were scarce this late in the year, and placed it in the coolest corner of the larder. He then returned to the small holding to tend to the ewes, who observed his approach with mild curiosity but little movement, merely shifting their weight from one foot to another. He checked the water trough, breaking a thin skin of ice with the heel of his boot and refilling it from the well using a heavy wooden bucket that required several trips. the rope rough against his palms, the wells cranked protesting with a high-pitched squeak that echoed faintly across the still fields. He forked more hay into their rack, watching them approach and begin to eat with the same slow deliberation that characterized all life in Upper Thistledown. Finally, he inspected the vegetable plot, though there was little to do beyond noting the stubborn persistence of a few weeds which he methodically extracted with his thick fingers, their roots clinging tenaciously to the cold, dark soil. The cabbages were tightly furled, globes of pale green veined with purple, their outer leaves toughened by frost. The leeks stood in soldierly rows, their white shanks buried deep, their flat, blue-green leaves flagging slightly. Hubert touched nothing, merely observed, his gaze passing over each plant like an inventory clerk confirming stock levels. This circuit of his domain completed, Hubert stood for a long moment in the center of the small holding, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his moleskin jacket, his felt hat pulled low, surveying the familiar scene, the cottage with its smoking chimney, the bare branches of the orchard trees etching stark patterns against the washed-out sky, the brown fields beyond his boundary hedge lying fallow, the distant smudge of woodland on the horizon. A single rook cawed lazily as it flapped towards the copse. Otherwise, silence reigned, thick and palpable, broken only by the whisper of a light breeze through the dry stalks of the harvested garden. It was a scene of utter tranquility, profound in its monotony, a landscape meticulously maintained in a state of suspended animation. Hubert inhaled deeply, the cold air filling his lungs, then exhaled a plume of vapor that hung briefly in the still air before dissipating. Satisfied that all was in its proper order, he turned and walked slowly back towards his cottage, his boots crunching softly on the frosted grass. Chapter 3. Back within the cottage, the residual warmth from the morning fire had settled into a comfortable, ambient temperature, though the corners of the room retained a lingering chill. Hubert removed his jacket and hat, hanging them precisely on the wooden pegs beside the door, and sat once more upon the low stool before the hearth. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers and ash, radiating a gentle, consistent heat. From a basket beside the hearth, he retrieved a large ball of undyed wool, coarse and slightly greasy to the touch, and a pair of long, bone knitting needles polished smooth by years of use. Knitting was Hubert's primary occupation during the long, idle hours between morning chores and the evening meal, a skill learned in childhood from his mother and practiced with unwavering dedication ever since. His current project was a sock, the second of a pair intended for his own use come winter. The first sock lay completed nearby, a thick, serviceable tube of dense ribbing, utterly plain and devoid of any decorative flourish. Hubert picked up the needles, the partially formed sock already stretched between them, and began to knit. His large, calloused hands moved with a surprising, almost mesmerizing dexterity, the needles clicking together in a soft, steady rhythm, click, 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 that filled the quiet room like the slow, comforting beat of a metronome. Each stitch was formed with meticulous care, the wool drawn through the loop at precisely the same tension as the one before it, the fabric growing with glacial slowness. His gaze was fixed not on the work itself, but on the embers of the fire, his mind seemingly as empty as the vast sky outside, focused entirely on the repetitive, tactile sensation of yarn sliding over wood, the slight resistance as a new loop was formed, the gentle tug to secure it. The pattern was simple, a basic K2, P2 ribbing that ran uninterrupted from cuff to toe, requiring no conscious thought, only the endless repetition of ingrained muscle memory. The wool itself possessed a faint, sheepy odor, mingling with the wood smoke and the lingering scent of porridge. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the cottage, measured only by the incremental growth of the sock and the gradual dimming of the light filtering through the small window. Outside, the pale sun continued its slow, arcing journey across the sky, its light growing thinner and more watery as the afternoon progressed. Occasionally, the silence was broken by the distant sound of a cart creaking along the lane, or the faint shout of a child from the far end of the village, but these intrusions were brief and quickly absorbed back into the encompassing stillness. Hubert knitted on, his posture unchanging, his breathing slow and even, the rhythmic clicking of the needles a constant, soporific counterpoint to the silence. The sock grew, row by identical row, the ribbing forming a deep, elastic cuff that would hug his calf snugly. The process was profoundly uneventful, devoid of any challenge or variation. A perfect embodiment of the quiet, undemanding nature of Hubert's existence. He paused only once, to add another small log to the fire, carefully positioning it amongst the embers to ensure it caught slowly and evenly without flaring, before resuming his knitting, the needles immediately finding their familiar rhythm once more. The ball of wool diminished almost imperceptibly. The shadows in the room lengthened and deepened, pooling in the corners and beneath the heavy oak table. The air grew cooler, prompting Hubert to edge his stool slightly closer to the hearth's gentle warmth. Still, he knitted, the dense, grey fabric emerging from his needles like slow magic, row upon identical row, loop upon identical loop, the sock gradually taking shape in his lap, a tangible manifestation of time passing in Upper Thistledown. Chapter 4. As the light through the small window faded from weak afternoon grey to the deeper, more somber hues of dusk, the rhythmic clicking of Hubert's knitting needles finally ceased. He carefully slid the needles free of the stitches, secured the end of the wool with a practiced twist, and placed the partially completed sock, along with its twin and the ball of wool, back into the basket beside the hearth. Stretching slowly, his joints emitting soft pops and cracks like dry twigs snapping, he rose from the stool and moved towards the larder. It was time to prepare the evening meal, a process as deliberate and unchanging as the rest of his day. He retrieved the earthenware crock of milk, now settled with a thick layer of cream risen to the top. Using a broad, shallow spoon, he carefully skimmed this cream into a small, glazed pot, tomorrow's butter, or perhaps to be stirred sparingly into porridge. The skimmed milk beneath was a pale blue-white. He poured a measure of this into a heavy iron pot and placed it near the edge of the hearth to warm slowly. From a sack in the larder, he scooped a generous portion of dried yellow peas into a bowl, poured cold well water over them, and set them aside to soak. This would form the basis of his supper, peas pudding, a thick, bland paste that was a staple of his diet. While the peas soaked and the milk warmed, Hubert attended to the fire, adding 2 more substantial logs and using the bellows to encourage a stronger, more active flame suitable for cooking. The flames leaped and crackled, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the cottage walls, momentarily animating the still space. Hubert then turned his attention to the small round loaf. He sawed off another thick slice, slightly thicker than the morning's portion, and placed this too near the hearth to toast, turning it patiently at regular intervals until both sides were a deep, uniform brown, the edges slightly blackened, releasing a warm, comforting aroma of charred grain. The toasted bread was placed on his trencher. The warmed milk was poured into a large, handleless mug. The peas, having absorbed some water and plumped slightly, were drained and then tipped into the iron pot with the milk. Hubert added a pinch of salt and a small knob of the butter churned yesterday, then began to stir the mixture slowly with a wooden spoon. The pot was positioned directly over the now vigorous flames, and Hubert stood watch, stirring constantly to prevent the thick mixture from catching and burning on the bottom of the pot. The peas pudding slowly thickened, bubbling sluggishly, releasing clouds of steam that smelled of cooked legumes and hot milk. The process required constant vigilance and steady stirring for a good 20 minutes, until the peas had broken down entirely into a smooth, pale yellow paste of uniform consistency. Hubert lifted the heavy pot from the fire using a thick cloth to protect his hands and spooned a large dollop of the steaming pudding onto the trencher beside the toast. He did not mix them, preferring to eat each component separately, alternating mouthfuls of the bland, comforting paste with bites of the dry, crunchy toast. He ate slowly, methodically, as he had at breakfast, his gaze once again fixed on some indeterminate point in the middle distance, his mind seemingly occupied by nothing more complex than the mechanics of chewing and swallowing. The silence of the cottage was now profound, the only sounds the scrape of his spoon, the crackle of the fire, and his own steady breathing. Outside, true darkness had fallen, a deep, velvety blackness unrelieved by moon or stars on this overcast night. The village of Upper Thistledown vanished into the gloom, its outlines swallowed by the night, the only visible sign of habitation the faint, flickering glow of candlelight or hearth fire glimpsed occasionally through a distant cottage window. Hubert finished his meal, meticulously cleaning the trencher and spoon as he had done that morning, the warm water in the basin quickly turning cloudy with residue. He poured the dirty water out the back door onto the vegetable garden, the splash startlingly loud in the nocturnal stillness. Returning inside, He banked the fire for the night, carefully covering the glowing embers with a thick layer of ash to preserve their heat until morning. He then lit a single tallow candle, its meager, guttering flame casting a small pool of wavering light that deepened the shadows in the rest of the room, the smell of burning fat sharp and pungent. Placing the candle holder on the small table beside his pallet, Hubert finally began the process of undressing, reversing the sequence of the morning: waistcoat, shirt, trousers, stockings, each garment folded with slow care and placed on the low chest at the foot of his bed. Clad only in his long, thick nightshirt of unbleached linen, he stood for a moment before the dying glow of the hearth, the candlelight throwing his large, stooped shadow against the rough stone wall. He blew out the candle, plunging the cottage into near total darkness, broken only by the faint, dull red gleam of the banked fire. He then lowered himself onto the straw pallet, the ropes beneath creaking softly in protest under his weight. Pulling the heavy woolen blankets up to his chin, Hubert lay on his back, staring up into the impenetrable darkness of the cottage rafters. The silence was absolute now, a physical presence in the room, broken only by the faint sigh of wind finding a chink in the cottage wall, the almost imperceptible settling of the embers in the hearth, and the slow, steady rhythm of Hubert's own breathing as it deepened and slowed, preparing for the long, dreamless sleep that would carry him through the cold night towards the identical routine of another day in Upper Thistledown. Chapter 5. Hubert awoke, as he always did, precisely as the first faint suggestion of dawn began to dilute the absolute blackness outside his small window. It was not a sudden awakening, but a slow, gradual surfacing from the depths of unconsciousness, a return to awareness marked first by the chill of the air on his face, then by the familiar scent of wood smoke and damp wool, and finally by the stiffness in his joints from hours of immobility on the unyielding pallet. He lay perfectly still for several minutes, eyes open in the gloom, listening. The wind had died down completely during the night, leaving a profound silence that seemed to press in upon the cottage walls. The banked fire offered no glow now, merely a residual warmth detectable only when he moved his hand near the hearthstones. He heard the distant, tentative crow of a rooster, answered moments later by another from a different part of the village, the sound thin and brittle in the cold air. A mouse scrabbled briefly somewhere within the thickness of the cottage wall, then fell silent. These were the only sounds. Satisfied that the world outside remained as it should be, Hubert pushed back the heavy blankets, the sudden influx of cold air causing him to draw a sharp breath, and swung his legs over the side of the pallet, his feet finding the packed earth floor. The chill of the floorboards seeped instantly through the thin soles of his nightshirt. He rose, the familiar sequence of pops and cracks accompanying his movement, and crossed the dark room to the hearth. Kneeling, he carefully raked away the layer of ash covering the embers, finding, as he expected, a few small, dull red coals still clinging to life deep within the bed. Using the bellows with practiced, gentle puffs, he coaxed these embers back into a visible glow, then began the meticulous process of rebuilding the fire, repeating the exact sequence of twigs, splinters, and logs he had employed the previous morning. The process was unhurried, requiring patience and precision. Only when a steady flame was established, its light beginning to push back the shadows and its warmth starting, incrementally, to combat the cottage's chill, did Hubert turn his attention to dressing. The routine was identical to yesterday's: thick stockings, coarse fustian trousers, rough linen shirt, bottle green woolen waistcoat, each garment pulled on with the same deliberate care. The kettle was filled and suspended over the growing fire. The wait for it to boil commenced. Hubert sat on the stool, his posture identical to the previous morning, his large hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the kettle, watching the slow accumulation of condensation on its blackened surface, the gradual strengthening of the steam plume. The world outside the cottage window lightened from deep grey to a pale, washed-out silver as dawn reluctantly arrived. No birds sang. It was too late in the year, and too cold. The skeletal branches of the apple trees in the orchard became visible, stark against the lightening sky. The frost covering the grass in the small holding glittered faintly. Inside, the kettle began its low, insistent hum. Hubert rose, measured the oats, added the salt, poured the water. The porridge bubbled, the bread was sawed, the slices placed on the iron plate to toast, turned patiently. The butter pat was retrieved, The meal was assembled and consumed with the same methodical slowness. The trencher and spoon were washed and dried. The jacket, hat, and boots were donned. The door was opened onto the frost-rimmed world. Daisy was fed, brushed, and milked. The milk was carried in, strained, and stored. The ewe's water trough was cleared of its thin new skin of ice and refilled, their hay rack replenished. The vegetable garden was inspected, the same hardy cabbages and leeks observed, a few more tenacious weeds plucked slowly from the cold ground. Hubert stood once more in the center of his small holding, hands in pockets, felt hat low, surveying the unchanged vista under the flat, grey light of a new day. The rook cawed again, perhaps the same one, flying towards the same copse. The silence settled back, thick and undisturbed. The routines of Upper Thistledown, unbroken and unchanging, stretched out before Hubert Gableby, as endless and predictable as the slow turning of the seasons or the gradual wearing down of stone by water. Chapter 6. The completion of the small holding inspection marked not an end but merely a transition within Hubert's circumscribed orbit. Returning to the cottage's dim interior, the residual warmth from the morning fire now a comfortable, enveloping presence, he removed his boots, jacket, and hat, placing each item with deliberate care upon the designated pegs, the felt hat settling with a soft sigh of displaced air. The milking pail and strainer, used earlier, required attention. He carried them outside to the stone trough by the well, scrubbing them meticulously with cold water and a handful of gritty sand scooped from the path, the abrasive particles rasping against the worn tin, removing every trace of milk's faint film. Rinsed clean and gleaming dully in the weak sunlight, they were returned to their hooks inside the cool, shadowed byre. Back within the cottage, Hubert surveyed the quiet space. The fire burned steadily, consuming the morning's logs at a predictably slow pace. The knitted sock lay waiting in its basket beside the stool, yet, today, a slight deviation, dictated by the season's slow decay, presented itself. The hinge on the small, weathered gate leading from his garden patch to the pasture had been protesting with an increasingly loud metallic groan for several days, a discordant note in the otherwise seamless harmony of his domain. Retrieving a leather pouch containing a few basic tools, a worn hammer, a screwdriver whose tip had seen better days, a small jar of thick, pungent goose grease, Hubert walked back out, boots donned once more, to the offending gate. He examined the hinge, its iron pitted with rust, the pin seized almost solid within its housing. For a long moment, he simply stood, contemplating the mechanism, his large, weathered hands hanging loosely at his sides. Then, with a grunt that seemed more directed at the hinge's stubbornness than exertion, he began. First, he applied the goose grease liberally around the pin's head and along the visible seam of the hinge leaves, the yellowish substance oozing slowly into the crevices. He waited, allowing the grease time to penetrate the rust's grip, his gaze fixed on the hinge as if expecting visible change. After several minutes of silent observation, he took up the hammer and screwdriver, using the latter not as a driver but as a drift, placing its tip against the bottom of the hinge pin and tapping it firmly, rhythmically, with the hammer's head. The sound, a sharp, high-pitched tink, 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 echoed strangely loud in the still air, startling a blackbird from the hedgerow. Progress was infinitesimal. Each tap yielded perhaps a fraction of a millimeter's movement, the pin rising with agonizing slowness. Hubert's expression remained impassive, focused, his movements unhurried yet persistent. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the autumn chill, not from effort but from the intense concentration required for such precise, repetitive action. He paused periodically to apply more grease, watching it seep into the newly created micro gaps, then resumed the tapping. The rhythm became hypnotic. Apply grease, wait, tap tap tap, observe, repeat. The sun climbed higher, its light strengthening marginally but offering little warmth. The blackbird returned, watching from a safe distance. Finally, after nearly an hour of this meticulous labor, the pin shifted noticeably, rising perhaps a quarter of an inch. Hubert carefully gripped its head with the worn jaws of a pair of pliers also retrieved from the pouch and, with a slow, steady pull accompanied by a final, protesting screech of metal, withdrew it completely. He wiped the pin clean of rust and old grease on a handful of dry grass, examined the hinge leaves, cleaning their mating surfaces with the same grass, then liberally re-greased both pin and socket. Sliding the pin back in was easier, a smooth glide punctuated only by the soft thunk as it seated fully home. He worked the gate back and forth. The movement was stiff, the hinge still far from silent, but the agonized groan had been reduced to a manageable, low-pitched creak. Satisfied with this improvement, a restoration of acceptable order rather than perfection, Hubert wiped his tools on the grass, returned them to the pouch, and stood for a moment, listening to the new, less intrusive sound of the gate swinging. It was enough, the discordance had been mitigated, order, of a rough-hewn, practical kind, was restored. He walked back to the cottage, the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the frosted path the only sound accompanying him. Chapter 7. The hinge repaired to a functional standard, Hubert re-entered the cottage, the familiar scent of wood smoke, wool, and cold earth welcoming him. He hung the tool pouch on its hook beside the hearth, washed his hands thoroughly in the basin with the harsh yellow soap, the grease requiring extra scrubbing to lift from the crevices of his knuckles and fingernails, the water turning cloudy and iridescent with oil, and dried them on the coarse linen towel. The fire had burned down to a compact bed of glowing embers, radiating a steady, gentle heat perfect for the long hours of sitting. He settled once more onto the low stool, the worn wood conforming slightly to his weight, and retrieved the knitting basket. The partially formed grey sock lay exactly as he had left it, the bone needles cool to the touch. Picking up the work, his fingers automatically finding their positions, he resumed knitting. The rhythm re-established itself immediately. Click, 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 a soft, metronomic counterpoint to the faint crackle of the embers. Stitch followed identical stitch, row followed identical row, the ribbing extending downwards towards the ankle with glacial inevitability. His gaze, as always, drifted towards the fire, not seeing the flames but absorbing their warmth and movement on some deeper, subconscious level. The morning's slight exertion with the hinge seemed already forgotten, absorbed into the seamless fabric of routine. The light outside shifted as clouds moved across the sun, brightening and dimming the cottage interior in slow, undulating waves. Once, the distant, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer carried from the far end of the village, a sound so regular and predictable it blended almost seamlessly with the clicking of Hubert's needles before fading away. Time became a tangible thing, measured in the growing length of grey woolen fabric and the incremental sinking of the fire's glow. Hubert's breathing remained slow and even, his posture unchanging, a statue carved from weathered oak brought to life only by the subtle, repetitive motion of his hands. The ball of wool in the basket diminished, the loops passing from its diminishing bulk onto the needles and then into the dense, unyielding structure of the sock. He paused only to reach forward and push a stray ember back into the main bed with the iron poker, a brief shower of sparks rising like ephemeral fireflies before vanishing into the gloom of the chimney. Otherwise, the stillness was profound, a physical presence in the room, thick and comforting in its familiarity. The sock grew, the ribbing now extending several inches below where the calf would narrow, the fabric dense and warm, promising protection against the deepening cold of the winter to come, though winter itself felt like a distant abstraction in this perpetual, muted autumn. The shadows began their slow afternoon creep across the packed earth floor, stretching from the single window like lengthening fingers of coolness. The air temperature within the cottage dropped perceptibly, prompting Hubert to shift his stool an inch closer to the hearth's radiant embrace. Still, he knitted, the needles clicking, the fire whispering, the world of Upper Thistledown holding its breath outside the thick stone walls. Chapter 8. The click of the needles finally ceased as the light leaching through the small window took on the unmistakable, diluted golden quality of late afternoon, signaling the inevitable approach of evening's routines. Hubert secured the last stitch of the row with a practiced twist of yarn, slid the needles free, and placed the sock, now significantly longer but still far from complete, back into its basket alongside its finished mate and the diminished ball of wool. He stretched, the vertebrae in his back releasing a series of muffled cracks, and rose from the stool, his knees stiff from prolonged immobility. The fire required attention. He added 2 small logs, positioning them carefully atop the glowing embers, and used the bellows sparingly, just enough to encourage a modest flame to lick around the new fuel without flaring excessively. The immediate task, however, was sustenance. The evening meal ritual began its unchanging sequence. He moved to the larder, its cool, earthy smell a counterpoint to the warmth of the hearth. The earthenware crock of milk was retrieved, The cream skimmed off with the broad spoon and deposited into the small glazed pot with the same care one might handle precious gems. The skimmed milk beneath looked thin and blue-gray in the dimming light. He poured a generous measure into the heavy iron cooking pot and placed it near the hearth's edge to warm. The sack of dried yellow peas was lifted from its shelf, the rustle of the coarse sacking loud in the quiet. He scooped out a portion, the hard, round peas rattling like tiny pebbles into the soaking bowl. Cold well water was poured over them, the level rising until the peas were submerged, their wrinkled surfaces slowly beginning to absorb the liquid. While they soaked and the milk warmed, Hubert attended to the bread. He sawed off another thick slice from the increasingly diminished loaf, the resistant texture requiring steady, firm pressure on the bone handle of the knife. This slice was placed directly onto the flat iron plate nestled amongst the coals at the fire's periphery. He turned it at precise intervals, watching as the pale surface gradually transformed into a deep, uniform mahogany brown, the edges blackening slightly, releasing that comforting, toasty aroma. The toasted bread was transferred to the waiting trencher. The warmed milk was poured from the pot into his large mug, a thin skin already forming on its surface. The soaked peas, now plump and softened, were drained, their soaking water tipped out onto the vegetable garden soil near the back door, a dark stain spreading momentarily on the frost-hardened earth. The peas themselves were added to the skimmed milk remaining in the iron pot, along with a pinch of salt and a smaller knob of yesterday's butter than he'd used at breakfast. The pot was then maneuvered directly over the now active flames, and Hubert took up his vigil, wooden spoon in hand. He stirred the mixture slowly, constantly, scraping the bottom of the pot with a firm, even pressure to prevent the thickening mass from adhering and scorching. The peas pudding began to bubble sluggishly, thick plopping sounds emerging as steam rose in dense clouds smelling of cooked legumes and hot, bland milk. The transformation from separate peas and liquid into a cohesive, pale yellow paste required unwavering attention and steady stirring for nearly half an hour, the process demanding physical endurance as much as patience, the weight of the iron pot and spoon transferring a dull ache up Hubert's arm. Finally, satisfied with its smooth, uniform consistency, he lifted the pot from the flames using a thick, folded cloth and spooned a large, steaming mound of the pudding beside the toast on the trencher. He sat at the small table, the firelight now the primary illumination as dusk gathered outside, and began to eat. Spoonfuls of the hot, glutinous paste alternated with bites of the dry, crunchy toast. He chewed slowly, methodically, his gaze unfocused, directed towards the dancing flames in the hearth. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of the spoon, the crackle of the fire, and the steady, unhurried sound of his mastication. Outside, the last vestiges of light faded, replaced by a deep, velvety darkness that pressed against the cottage windows. Upper Thistledown vanished, swallowed whole by the night, leaving only the small, flickering island of warmth and quiet industry within Hubert Gableby's walls. Chapter 9. The trencher scraped perfectly clean, every molecule of peas pudding and every crumb of toast accounted for. Hubert rose and carried the wooden dish and spoon to the basin. Washing commenced, a familiar ritual of cold water, the sliver of harsh yellow soap producing minimal lather but effective cleansing power, and the rough linen drying cloth. The basin's water turned cloudy with residue. He carried it outside, the chill night air striking his face like a physical blow, and emptied it onto the frost-rimmed soil near the leaks, the splash startlingly loud in the profound stillness. Returning inside, he closed and barred the stout oak door against the encompassing dark and cold. The fire needed banking for the night. He carefully raked the glowing embers into a compact, concentrated mound at the very back of the hearth, then covered them completely with a thick, insulating layer of fine grey ash scooped from the ash pit beside the hearth. This done, the fire's light and heat were effectively entombed, preserved only as latent warmth within the stones. Only then did Hubert light the single tallow candle, its wick sputtering before catching, casting a small, unstable sphere of dim, yellowish light that pushed the shadows back only a few feet, deepening the darkness in the corners and rafters. The smell of burning animal fat, sharp and slightly rancid, filled the small space. He carried the candle holder to the low chest beside his pallet, placing it carefully on the scarred wooden surface. The undressing ritual began, a precise reversal of the morning's sequence. First the bottle green woolen waistcoat, unbuttoned slowly, folded neatly along its creases, and placed on the chest, then the rough linen shirt, pulled over his head, revealing a thick, barrel chest covered in coarse grey hair, the garment shaken out and folded with the same care, the fustian trousers followed, unbuttoned, stepped out of, folded precisely, finally, the thick woolen stockings were peeled off, each rolled into a loose ball and placed atop the trousers. Clad only in his long, thick nightshirt, Hubert stood for a long moment before the darkened hearth, the candlelight casting his large, stooped shadow against the rough stone wall like a brooding giant. He watched the shadow, his face impassive, then turned, the shadow mimicking his movement with ponderous slowness. Reaching the candle, he bent slightly, his shadow engulfing the entire end wall, and with a soft puff of breath, extinguished the flame. Darkness, absolute and impenetrable, descended instantly. Only the faintest, dullest red glow, like a single dying ember seen from miles away, emanated from the center of the ash-covered mound in the hearth. Guided by memory and touch alone, Hubert navigated the 2 paces to his pallet. The straw crunched faintly as he lowered his considerable weight onto it, the ropes beneath creaking in familiar protest. He pulled the heavy woolen blankets up to his chin, tucking the edges tightly around his shoulders and sides, creating a cocoon. Against the night's chill, lying flat on his back, he stared upwards into the profound blackness, seeing nothing, yet aware of the familiar shapes and presences around him, the table, the stool, the hearth, the larder door. The silence was total, a vast, empty cathedral. His breathing, deep and slow at first, gradually regulated itself into the steady, even rhythm of sleep. Outside, nothing stirred, no wind sighed, no owl called. The world of Upper Thistledown, and Hubert Gableby within it, surrendered completely to the deep, dreamless oblivion of the November night. Chapter 10. Consciousness returned not with a jolt, but with the slow, inevitable seepage of grey light into the cottage's absolute darkness, a gradual dilution of the void that preceded true dawn. Hubert opened his eyes, aware first of the cold air on his face exposed above the blankets, then of the deep, familiar ache in his hips and shoulders from the unyielding pallet, and finally of the profound, ringing silence that pressed in from all sides. He lay perfectly still, listening, as was his invariable practice. The silence was complete, thicker even than the night before, undisturbed by rooster or mouse or wind. The banked fire offered no visual sign of life, though a faint, residual warmth still emanated from the hearthstones if he strained his senses. After several minutes of this motionless vigil, confirming the world's continued adherence to its silent, predictable course, Hubert pushed back the heavy blankets. The rush of cold air provoked a sharp intake of breath, visible as a brief plume in the dim grey light filtering through the window. He swung his legs over the side, his bare feet meeting the packed earth floor, the cold shock traveling instantly up his calves, rising. The familiar symphony of pops and cracks accompanied his stiff movements. He crossed the dark room to the hearth, knelt on the hearthstone, and carefully, methodically, raked away the insulating layer of ash. Deep within the mound, a few stubborn embers, no larger than peppercorns, glowed with a dull, sullen red persistence. He took the worn leather bellows, its surface cool and slightly tacky, and applied the gentlest possible puffs of air. The embers brightened momentarily, flickering with a faint orange promise. He added the finest dried twigs, gathered weeks ago and stored in a basket beside the hearth, arranging them with infinite care over the glowing points. More gentle puffs, a tiny tendril of smoke curled upwards, followed by the faintest lick of yellow flame. Hubert watched, unmoving, patient as stone. Gradually, almost reluctantly, the flames took hold, consuming the twigs, their light growing, casting faint, dancing shadows that were the room's first movement since the candle's extinguishing. He added slightly larger splinters, then small slivers of dry oak, building the fire with the same unhurried precision, the same sequence, as every morning that had come before it. Only when a steady, self-sustaining flame was established, its light now sufficient to see the outlines of the room's sparse furnishings, its warmth beginning the slow, patient battle against the night's entrenched chill, did Hubert turn to the task of dressing. The sequence was ingrained, automatic. Thick woolen stockings unrolled and pulled up over cold feet, coarse fustian trousers buttoned over them, the rough linen shirt tugged over his head and tucked in, the bottle green woolen waistcoat stretched across his broad frame. Each button slipped through its hole with practiced ease. The kettle was filled from the earthenware pitcher, the water cold and tasting faintly of the deep earth, and suspended over the strengthening fire. Hubert sat on the low stool, his large hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the kettle's blackened bottom, watching the first beads of condensation form and merge, waiting for the steam's first whisper, the prelude to the hum. Outside, the world lightened from deep grey to a pale, washed silver. Frost etched intricate patterns on the cottage's small window pane. The skeletal branches of the apple trees became visible, stark sentinels against the lightening sky. Inside, the familiar rituals unfolded. The kettle's hum, the oats measured, the salt pinched, the water poured, the porridge bubbling, the bread sawed, the slices toasted with infinite patience, the butter pat placed, the meal assembled and consumed with deliberate, unhurried bites, the trencher cleaned, the tools of the morning, pail, strainer, gathered, the jacket, hat, and boots donned. The door opened onto the frost-whitened world. Daisy greeted with hay and brush, the milk pinged steadily into the pail, the ewe's water trough cleared, refilled, their hay replenished, the garden inspected, the same cabbages, the same leeks, a few more frost-nipped weeds removed. Hubert stood once more, a solid figure in moleskin and felt, hands in pockets, surveying the unchanged vista under the flat, featureless grey sky, a single rook cawed, its call lonely in the vast silence, the routines of Upper Thistledown, as immutable as the slow erosion of the hills, claimed Hubert Gableby once more, the wheel of his existence turning with the seamless, silent precision of a well-oiled mechanism set in motion at the dawn of time. Chapter 11. The completion of the small holding circuit, a ritual as unchanging as the path his boots traced through the frost-stiffened grass, left Hubert standing momentarily at the boundary where his tended plot met the wilder common land. The air held a sharper bite today, a metallic tang of impending frost deeper than the previous mornings, nipping at the exposed skin of his cheeks and tightening the skin across his knuckles. He observed the leaden sky, a uniform sheet of low, featureless cloud pressing down upon the landscape like a damp woolen blanket, promising neither sun nor immediate snow, merely a continuation of the damp, pervasive cold. Turning his back on the vista, he retraced his steps to the cottage, the crunch of frost underfoot louder, more brittle. Inside, the warmth from the morning fire was a palpable relief, settling into his chilled bones as he removed outer layers and hung them precisely. The milking pail and strainer, already scrubbed clean of Daisy's offering, needed only to be returned to their hooks in the cool dimness of the byre. Back within the stone walls, Hubert's gaze fell upon the knitting basket beside the hearth. The partially formed grey sock lay inert, awaiting his hands, yet a different task presented itself, observed during his garden inspection. A length of wicker edging bordering the leek bed had worked loose, its willow withes frayed and brittle from years of exposure to damp earth and frost. Retrieving the worn leather tool pouch once more, Hubert selected a coil of thin, tarred twine and a short, sharp awl with a bone handle polished smooth by use. He walked back out into the strengthening cold, the air feeling denser now, heavier with unshed moisture, and knelt on the cold earth beside the damaged section of edging. The dampness immediately seeped through the thick fabric of his trousers. He examined the break, the willow strand splayed and weakened. His large hands, surprisingly nimble, began the repair. Using the awl, he carefully pierced new holes in the sound wicker adjacent to the break, the sharp point pushing through the resistant fibers with a soft pop each time. Then, threading the tarred twine onto a large, blunt needle also kept in the pouch, he began to bind the frayed ends back into the main structure, weaving the twine in and out with slow, deliberate stitches, pulling each loop tight with a firm, steady tug. The tar on the twine left dark smudges on his fingers and imparted a faint, pungent scent of pine and creosote to the cold air. His breath plumed steadily before him as he worked, a visible rhythm accompanying the silent focus of his task. The cold numbed his fingertips, but he worked on, methodically, his concentration absolute, the world narrowing to the point of the awl, the path of the needle, the tension of the twine. A few flakes of snow, desultory and dry, began to drift down, melting instantly on the dark earth and the grey wool of his sleeve. He ignored them, securing the final stitch with a complex knot buried deep within the weave, then trimming the excess twine with a small, sharp knife. He tested the repair, pressing against the mended section. It held firm, no longer loose and rattling in the wind. Satisfied, a small, unspoken affirmation of order restored, he gathered his tools, wiped the worst of the mud and tar from his hands onto a clump of frosted grass, and returned to the cottage, the first true snow beginning to fall with more purpose now, large, lazy flakes spiraling down from the oppressive sky. Chapter 12. The scent of tar and damp wool clung to Hubert as he re-entered the cottage. Mingling with the wood smoke, he washed his hands thoroughly in the basin, the tar requiring vigorous scrubbing with the harsh yellow soap, turning the water murky brown, before drying them on the coarse linen towel, the rough fibers catching on the calluses. The fire still glowed steadily, radiating a deep, comforting heat that filled the lower half of the room. Hubert settled onto the low stool, the familiar contours of the wood welcoming his weight, and reached for the knitting basket. The grey sock, cool and inert, was lifted, the bone needles fitting naturally into his grip. He resumed knitting. The rhythm, the soft click, 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 began instantly, a metronome measuring the slow passage of time within the stone walls. Stitch followed stitch, row followed row, the dense ribbing extending further down the leg towards the heel flap, each loop identical to the last, the grey wool passing through his fingers with the smoothness of long practice. His gaze, as ever, drifted towards the fire, watching the flames dance and curl around the half-consumed log, their light flickering on the rough stone of the hearth and the worn wood of the stool legs. The snowfall outside intensified, visible through the small window as a swirling curtain of white, muting the already dim light further, casting the cottage interior into a twilight gloom despite it being only mid-morning. The flakes fell thickly, silently, blanketing the garden, the orchard, the lane beyond. Hubert knitted on, unfazed, the rhythmic clicking of the needles a constant counterpoint to the silent spectacle outside. The cold seemed to press more insistently against the thick walls and small window, but the hearth's warmth held it firmly at bay, creating a sphere of snug isolation. The ball of wool in the basket diminished slowly, steadily, its bulk transferring loop by identical loop into the growing fabric on the needles. Hubert's breathing remained slow and deep, his posture unchanged, a study in focused tranquility. The only movement beyond his hands was the occasional shifting of a log in the fire, sending a brief cascade of sparks upwards, or the slow drift of snow piling against the window pane. The sock grew, the heel flap beginning to take shape, a subtle widening in the fabric requiring a slight, automatic adjustment in his stitch count, executed without conscious thought. The silence within the cottage deepened, amplified by the muffling effect of the snow outside. A profound quietude broken only by the fire's whisper and the soft, insistent click, click, click of the bone needles, a sound as much a part of Hubert Gableby as the beating of his own heart. Chapter 13. The light within the cottage, already dimmed by the snow-laden sky and the flakes clinging to the window pane, faded steadily towards the diluted gold of late afternoon, though the thick blanket of snow outside made the actual time difficult to gauge. Hubert secured the final stitch of the heel flap row, a minor milestone in the sock's glacial progress, and carefully placed the work back into its basket. The fire had burned low, needing replenishment. He added 2 medium-sized logs, positioning them carefully amidst the glowing embers, and used the bellows sparingly to encourage a steady flame, sufficient for cooking but not wasteful. The familiar sequence of the evening meal began. Rising stiffly, he moved to the cool larder, retrieving the earthenware crock. The layer of cream was skimmed with the broad spoon, its thick, pale yellow richness deposited into the small glazed pot. The skimmed milk beneath looked thin and wan. He poured a measure into the heavy iron pot and placed it near the hearth's edge. The sack of dried peas rustled as he scooped out a portion, the hard pellets rattling into the soaking bowl. Cold water covered them. The bread loaf, now significantly reduced, yielded another thick slice under the bone-handled knife's steady pressure. This slice was placed directly onto the hot iron plate nestled in the coals. Hubert turned it with precise timing, watching the transformation to deep brown, the edges curling slightly black, filling the cottage with the warm, comforting scent of toasted grain. The toasted bread was placed on the trencher. The warm milk was poured into his large mug. The soaked peas, plump and softened, were drained, their water discarded onto the frozen ground outside the back door with a splash that sounded unnaturally loud in the snow-muffled silence. The peas joined the skimmed milk in the iron pot, along with salt and a modest knob of butter. The pot was maneuvered over the flames, and Hubert took up his wooden spoon, beginning the slow, constant stirring. The mixture thickened slowly, bubbling with thick, glutinous plots, steam rising in dense clouds smelling of cooked legumes and warm milk. The snowfall continued unabated outside, piling in soft drifts against the cottage walls and the orchard trees, transforming the familiar landscape into a featureless expanse of white. Hubert stirred, his arm moving in a slow, endless circle, scraping the bottom of the pot, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window where the swirling white curtain obscured everything beyond a few feet. The transformation to smooth paste took its usual time. He lifted the heavy pot, spooned the steaming peas pudding beside the toast, and sat at the table. He ate slowly, methodically, spoonfuls of the bland paste alternating with bites of dry toast, the firelight his only illumination now as the snow-induced twilight deepened rapidly into full night. The silence within was profound, absolute, broken only by the scrape of his spoon, the crackle of the fire, and the soft, rhythmic sound of his chewing. Outside, the world was utterly silent, buried under the deepening white shroud. Upper Thistledown vanished, leaving only the small, warm, silent island of Hubert's cottage and the steady, unhurried consumption of his evening meal. Chapter 14. The trencher, scraped clean with the same meticulous care as always, was washed in the basin with cold water and the harsh yellow soap, the residue of peas pudding dissolving slowly. The dirty water was carried outside. The shock of cold air was intense, the snowfall lessening but the temperature plummeting, the air so still and frigid it felt brittle. Hubert emptied the basin. The water hit the frozen ground and instantly began to freeze at the edges of the dark patch it created, a faint crackling sound accompanying its spread. He retreated quickly inside, barring the door firmly against the deepening cold. Banking the fire followed, raking the embers into a compact mound, covering them completely with a thick layer of insulating ash, entombing the heat within the hearthstones. The single tallow candle was lit, its guttering flame casting long, dancing shadows that seemed unnaturally large and fluid in the otherwise motionless room. The smell of burning tallow, sharp and slightly acrid, cut through the lingering scent of supper. He carried the candle to the chest beside the pallet. Undressing commenced, the precise reversal of the morning: woolen waistcoat unbuttoned, folded, placed, rough linen shirt pulled off, shaken, folded, fustian trousers stepped out of, folded, thick stockings peeled off, rolled, placed. Clad in his long nightshirt, Hubert stood before the darkened hearth, the candlelight throwing his immense, stooped shadow against the stones. He observed it for a long moment, the shadow's stillness mirroring his own, then turned. Bending to the candle, he extinguished the flame with a soft puff. Darkness, thick and absolute, swallowed the cottage whole. Only the faintest, deepest red glow, like a single dying coal seen through dense fog, emanated from the heart of the ash-covered mound. Navigating by touch and ingrained memory, Hubert found the edge of his pallet. The straw crunched as he lowered himself, the ropes groaning. He pulled the heavy blankets up, tucking them tightly around his body, creating a fortress against the encroaching cold. Lying flat on his back, he stared into the impenetrable blackness above. The silence was total, immense, a physical weight pressing down. The deep cold seemed to seep through the stone walls, a presence felt even beneath the blankets. Outside, no sound penetrated the snow-blanketed world. No wind stirred the laden branches, no creature ventured forth in the lethal cold. The silence stretched, vast and unbroken, a void punctuated only by the slow, deep rhythm of Hubert's own breathing as it gradually deepened and slowed, leading him down into the profound, dreamless depths of a winter's sleep beneath the silent, snowbound sky. Chapter 15. Awareness returned gradually, seeping into the profound darkness like ink dispersing in still water. Hubert opened his eyes to a different quality of gloom. The absolute blackness of deep night had lightened to a dense, pearly grey, thick and muffled. He lay still, listening, but the silence was even more profound than the night before, a deep, cotton wool hush that seemed to absorb sound before it could form. The cold was intense, sharper than previous mornings, biting at his nose and cheeks above the blankets. The banked fire offered no discernible warmth at this distance. After the customary minutes of motionless listening, confirming only the vast, snow-induced silence, Hubert pushed back the blankets. The cold struck like a physical blow, forcing a sharp gasp. He swung his legs out, his bare feet meeting the floor, the cold shock jolting up his legs. Rising brought the familiar chorus of pops and cracks, louder in the dense quiet. He crossed to the hearth, knelt, raking away the ash revealed the embers, smaller, cooler, barely glowing with a faint, sullen red persistence, the cold night having leached more of the vital heat. The bellows felt stiff, the leather cold. He applied the gentlest puffs. The embers brightened feebly, offering little promise. Adding the finest twigs required immense patience. They smoked, reluctant to catch, the cold seeming to dampen their very spirit. More puffs, focused, persistent. Finally, a tiny, hesitant flame flickered, then caught hold on a twig. Hubert shielded it with his hand, coaxing it, adding infinitesimally larger splinters one by one, building the fire with agonizing slowness, the cold fighting him every step. The light grew, revealing the cottage interior in stark, shadowed relief. Frost ferns etched elaborate patterns across the small window pane, opaque and thick. The dressing sequence felt more laborious in the intense cold. Stockings, trousers, shirt, waistcoat, each layer providing scant relief against the pervasive chill. The kettle was filled, the water icy, suspended over the fledgling fire. It seemed to take an eternity for the first wisps of steam to appear. Hubert sat on the stool, hands on knees, watching the kettle with intense focus, willing the heat to grow. Outside, the grey light revealed a world transformed. Snow lay deep and unbroken, a pristine white blanket smothering the garden, the orchard, the lane, the hedges, smoothing every contour, erasing boundaries, reflecting the dull grey sky with a flat, featureless glare. The snowfall had ceased, leaving a landscape of profound, silent stillness, the trees burdened with thick cloaks of white. Inside, the rituals unfolded with glacial slowness against the cold, the kettle's eventual hum weak at first, the oats measured, the salt pinched, the water poured, the porridge bubbling sluggishly, the bread soared from a loaf now hardened by the cold, the slices toasted with infinite patience over the modest fire, the butter pat hard and resistant. The meal was assembled, consumed slowly, the warmth of the porridge a small, vital comfort against the cold that permeated the stone walls. The trencher cleaned, tools gathered, outer layers donned. The door opened onto the crystalline world. The snow was deep, crisp, and unmarked save for Hubert's own boot prints from the previous day, already softened by fresh fall. The air was knife-edge sharp, breathtakingly cold. Daisy's fire felt marginally warmer, the animal's body heat contained. She was fed, brushed, milked, the ping of milk in the pail sounding strangely clear in the frozen air. The milk, carried back, seemed to chill instantly. The ewe's water trough was frozen solid, requiring vigorous chopping with the heel of his boot and the handle of the hay fork to break the thick ice before refilling. Their hay was replenished. The garden was a featureless white mound, only the tops of the sturdiest cabbages showing as vague, snow-capped lumps. Hubert stood, a dark, solid figure against the blinding white expanse, hands thrust deep into pockets, felt hat pulled low, surveying the transformed yet fundamentally unchanged world under the heavy grey sky. The silence was immense, absolute, a frozen cathedral. The routines of Upper Thistledown, muted and slowed by the snow but unbroken, claimed Hubert Gableby once more, his breath pluming steadily in the frigid air, the wheel of his existence turning slowly, silently, in the heart of the winter stillness. Chapter 16. The profound silence of the snowbound world pressed against the cottage walls like a physical weight as Hubert closed the door on the crystalline stillness. Inside, the comparative warmth felt thick and precious after the knife-edge cold outside. He removed his snow-dusted boots with stiff fingers, the laces stiff with frost, placing them precisely on the stone slab by the hearth to thaw slowly, their leather steaming faintly. The moleskin jacket, heavy with damp cold, was hung on its peg, followed by the snow-caked felt hat, the chill radiating from his outer layers momentarily challenged the fire's hard-won warmth. He carried the pail of milk, already forming a thin skin of ice crystals on its surface, to the larder, straining it through muslin into the earthenware crock with hands still numb from exposure. The task required extra care, his thick fingers clumsy with cold. Returning to the hearth, he added another log, smaller than usual to conserve the dwindling wood pile stacked neatly against the back wall. Positioning it carefully amongst the glowing coals, flames licked tentatively at the new fuel. Hubert sat heavily on the low stool, the wood's chill penetrating his trousers instantly. He extended his large, work-roughened hands towards the fire's heat, palms outward, feeling the blessed warmth slowly seep into his bones, driving out the deep, aching cold. The knuckles, reddened and chapped, began to sting as sensation returned. He flexed his fingers slowly, watching the firelight play over the ingrained dirt and old scars. The knitting basket sat untouched beside him. The deep cold demanded stillness, a conservation of energy. He remained seated, motionless save for the slight shifting of his hands, absorbing the fire's warmth, his gaze fixed on the hypnotic dance of the flames as they consumed the log, their light flickering on the frost-ferned windowpane and the thickly thatched roof beams overhead. The silence within was absolute, a counterpoint to the muffled vastness outside, broken only by the soft crackle and hiss of burning wood and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves onto the frozen ground below. Time stretched, measured by the slow recession of cold from his extremities and the gradual consumption of the log. The light outside remained flat and grey, the snow-reflected glare offering no clue to the hour. Hubert sat, a patient monolith by the fire, waiting for his body to remember warmth, the rhythms of Upper Thistledown momentarily suspended in the grip of the frozen day. Chapter 17. Warmth, or at least the absence of biting cold, had finally settled deep within Hubert's core. He shifted on the stool, the stiffness in his joints a familiar companion. His gaze drifted from the fire to the knitting basket. The grey sock, partially formed, lay coiled within. He lifted it, the bone needles cool but not painfully cold now, settling the work onto his lap. His fingers found their familiar positions automatically. The rhythm began, click, click, click. The sound sharp and clear in the encompassing quiet, a small declaration of normalcy against the muffled world outside. Stitch followed stitch in the dense ribbing, the heel flap now complete, the fabric turning downwards towards the foot. His hands moved with the usual deliberate slowness, the wool sliding smoothly, each loop formed with meticulous tension. His gaze returned to the fire, not watching his hands, trusting the decades of ingrained muscle memory. The snowfall had ceased entirely, leaving a world locked in frozen stasis. The light through the window was the unchanging, diffused grey of a snow-laden sky, casting the cottage interior in perpetual twilight. The firelight painted warm, dancing highlights on Hubert's impassive face and the rough stone walls, deepening the shadows in the corners. The ball of wool diminished with glacial slowness, its grey bulk transferring loop by loop into the fabric growing on the needles. Hubert knitted on, his breathing slow and even, the only movement the subtle flexing of his fingers and forearms. The profound silence outside seemed to amplify the small sounds within, the soft click of the needles, the gentle sigh of a settling ember, the faint drip-drip from the eaves. The sock grew, the shape of the foot beginning to emerge, a narrowing tube of dense grey wool. The cold remained a presence, a subtle tightening of the air, held at bay only by the circle of warmth radiating from the hearth. Hubert remained within this circle, a fixed point in the frozen landscape, the rhythmic clicking of his needles a tiny, persistent heartbeat in the vast, white silence of Upper Thistledown's deepest winter. Chapter 18. The grey light filtering through the frost-thickened windowpane began, almost imperceptibly, to deepen towards the muted bronze of late afternoon. Though the snowbound landscape offered no true sunset, Hubert secured the final stitch of the row marking the start of the toe decreases, a subtle narrowing requiring a slight shift in pattern executed without conscious thought. He placed the sock, now recognizably nearing completion, back into its basket. The fire needed tending. The log had burned down to a compact bed of glowing embers radiating steady heat but offering little light. He added 2 smaller logs and a handful of dry kindling, using the bellows sparingly to encourage a modest flame, sufficient for the evening's needs but mindful of the dwindling woodpile. The familiar sequence of supper preparation commenced. Rising, he moved to the larder, its coolness even more pronounced against the cottage air. The earthenware crock felt icy, skimming the cream required patience, the thick layer resisting the spoon slightly in the cold. The skimmed milk looked thin and blue. He poured a measure into the heavy iron pot, placing it near the hearth's edge. The sack of dried peas rustled loudly as he scooped them into the soaking bowl. The sound of water pouring from the pitcher seemed unnaturally sharp. The remaining bread loaf was a dense, cold cylinder. Sawing off a thick slice required significant effort, the knife blade scraping against the hardened crust. The slice was placed on the iron plate amongst the coals. Turning it was a careful operation, the heat less intense than usual. It toasted slowly, achieving a deep brown only at the very edges. Placed on the trencher, it looked smaller, harder. The warm milk formed a thick skin almost instantly. The soaked peas, drained of their icy water outside, the splash instantly freezing on contact, were added to the milk in the pot with salt and a small, hard knob of butter, positioned over the low flames. The mixture required constant, vigilant stirring to prevent it from sticking and burning on the cooler spots of the pot. Hubert stood, wooden spoon in hand, stirring the thick, pale sludge, his shadow thrown large and wavering on the wall by the firelight. The transformation was slower in the reduced heat, the peas pudding thickening reluctantly, bubbling with thick, infrequent plops. Steam rose in thin, listless wisps. Outside, the world was a monochrome study in white and deepening grey, utterly silent, utterly still. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of cooking legumes and wood smoke, and the profound quiet was broken only by the scrape of the spoon, the faint crackle of the fire, and Hubert's steady, unhurried breathing as he maintained his vigil over the simmering pot. Chapter 19. The peas pudding achieved its requisite smooth, thick consistency after an extended period of stirring. Hubert lifted the heavy pot, his arm aching dully, and spooned a generous mound beside the hard toast on the trencher. He sat at the small table, the firelight now the sole illumination as the last vestiges of grey light vanished from the window, replaced by the absolute blackness of a snowbound night. He began to eat. The pudding was hot, a welcome contrast to the pervasive chill, but slightly grainy from the peas not fully breaking down in the lower heat. The toast was tough, requiring determined chewing. He ate slowly, methodically, as always, spoonfuls of paste alternating with bites of toast, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. The silence within the cottage was profound, amplified by the utter stillness outside. No wind sighed around the eaves. No creature stirred in the frozen world. The snow absorbed all sound, creating a vacuum. The scrape of his spoon on the wooden trencher, the crunch of toast between his teeth, the soft crackle of the fire, these sounds existed in a bubble of intimacy, small and precise against the vast, muffled silence pressing in from the darkness beyond the walls. Hubert consumed every morsel, the act a necessary ritual against the cold. Finishing, he washed the trencher and spoon meticulously, the cold water in the basin numbing his hands anew. Carrying the basin outside to empty it was a brief plunge back into the frigid void. The water hit the snow with a soft thump and froze almost instantly into a dark, glistening patch. He retreated quickly, barred the door, and banked the fire with extreme care, raking the embers into a tight, concentrated core and burying them deep under a thick blanket of ash, preserving every possible spark of warmth for the long, frozen night ahead. The tallow candle's lighting was a small act of defiance against the darkness, its meager flame gutted in the cold draft near the door as he carried it to the chest. Undressing was a swift, functional affair, each layer removed exposing skin to the biting air. Folding was done with rapid precision. Clad in his nightshirt, he stood for only a heartbeat before the banked hearth, the candlelight throwing his shivering shadow hugely on the wall. Extinguishing the flame plunged the cottage into a darkness so complete it felt solid. The cold intensified instantly, a physical presence, navigating by touch alone. Hubert found his palate, the straw crunching like broken glass under the blankets. He burrowed deep, pulling the heavy wool up over his ears, tucking the edges fiercely around himself. Lying rigid, he stared into the blackness, listening to the silence, a silence so deep it seemed to hum in his ears. The cold seeped through the layers, his breath plumed visibly in the faint red glow emanating from one tiny, persistent ember deep within the ash mound. Sleep came slowly, a hard-won surrender to the frozen heart of the winter night. Chapter 20. Consciousness returned not to darkness, but to a strange, grey luminescence filtering through the cottage window. Hubert opened his eyes, his breath instantly forming a thick cloud in the air above the blankets. The cold was intense, sharper and deeper than any morning yet, penetrating the wool covers and biting into his flesh. He lay perfectly still, assessing. The silence remained absolute, profound, The faint red glow from the hearth was absent. Raking away the ash revealed only dead, grey powder. The fire had gone out completely during the long, frigid night. A deep stillness, colder than the air itself, settled within him. He pushed back the blankets, the cold assaulting him with shocking violence. Moving quickly, stiffly, his joints protesting loudly, he dressed with uncharacteristic haste, pulling on layers over his nightshirt, stockings, trousers, shirt, waistcoat, his fingers fumbling with buttons. The cottage air was bitterly cold, his breath hanging thick and persistent. He knelt by the dead hearth, the stone icy beneath his knees. The tinderbox felt frozen, striking flint against steel produced reluctant sparks that died instantly on the cold, unprimed tinder. It took repeated attempts, numb fingers struggling, before a tiny spark caught on a scrap of dry moss. He cupped it gently, blowing with short, controlled breaths, adding the finest twigs one by one. The flame was feeble, hesitant, threatened constantly by the pervasive cold. Patience, immense and focused, was required. Minutes stretched as he coaxed the tiny fire, shielding it with his body, feeding it infinitesimal fragments of kindling. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a sustainable flame emerged, flickering weakly but persistently. Adding small splinters, then slightly larger ones, he rebuilt the fire from nothing, the process consuming nearly an hour, his hands aching with cold despite their proximity to the nascent flames. Only when a steady, self-sustaining fire crackled did he fill the kettle. The water inside the pitcher skimmed with a layer of ice. Suspending it over the flames, he sat back on the stool, utterly spent, watching the first wisps of steam rise with a profound sense of hard-won victory against the frozen silence. Outside, the grey light revealed a world still locked in snow, pristine and silent. The routines of Upper Thistledown, tested by the deep freeze, would resume, but this morning, Hubert Gableby had wrested warmth back from the icy grasp of winter, one fragile flame at a time. Chapter 21. The fragile flame, wrested from the frozen silence with aching hands and sheer persistence, grew steadily stronger as Hubert sat motionless before the hearth, the deep cold still clinging to the cottage's stone walls like a living thing. The kettle, suspended over the strengthening fire, began its low, insistent hum, a sound that felt like the first true victory of the morning against the encompassing frost. Steam thickened, swirling in the chill air before being drawn up into the chimney's gloom. Hubert remained seated, his large hands resting on his knees, palms still tingling with the remembered numbness, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on the growing plume from the kettle's spout, a focal point in the grey, snow-brightened light filtering through the thickly frosted windowpane where intricate ice ferns obscured the world beyond. The rituals, though delayed, began their familiar sequence with renewed gravity. Coarse oats measured with a hand that trembled only slightly from the lingering cold and exertion, the pinch of salt from the wooden bowl, the careful pouring of boiling water that hissed against the cold sides of the smaller pot. The porridge bubbled thickly, releasing clouds of steam that carried the bland, vital scent of hot grain, a small beacon of warmth in the frigid air. The remaining heel of the bread loaf, hardened almost to the density of seasoned oak, required patient, forceful sawing with the bone-handled knife, the rasping sound loud in the quiet. The slices, thick and resistant, were placed on the iron plate amidst the coals, toasted with infinite care, turned frequently to prevent charring while coaxing a deep, uneven brown from the reluctant heat. The butter pat, retrieved from the cold larder, was hard and pale, yielding slowly to the warmth of the toast only at its edges. The meal assembled on the trencher, steaming porridge, tough toast, stubborn butter, was consumed with the same methodical slowness, each bite a deliberate act of sustenance against the pervasive cold, his jaws working steadily, his eyes fixed on the fire's progress as it slowly pushed back the night's deep freeze from the cottage's heart. Chapter 22. The trencher scraped clean, the ritual washing completed in water that numbed his fingers afresh, Hubert donned his outer layers with deliberate care. The moleskin jacket felt stiff, still damp with old snowmelt and cold. The felt hat, heavy and cold, settled over his brow, pulling on the hobnailed boots. The laces stiff and unyielding, required patient working. Opening the cottage door revealed a world transformed yet again by the relentless cold. The snow lay pristine, deep, and blindingly white under a sky the color of tarnished lead, the air so still and frigid it seemed to crackle. his breath plumed massively, hanging like frozen fog before dissipating slowly. The path to the byre was a trench carved by yesterday's steps, now filled with fresh, powdery snow that rose above his boot tops, each step a laborious crunch and lift. Daisy greeted him with a soft, low moo, her breath also pluming in the icy air of the stone byre, warmer than outside but still biting. The familiar routine of forking hay, the sweet smell momentarily vivid in the cold, rushing her broad flank where frost clung to her coarse hair, felt like an anchor. The milking stool was icy, settling beside her warm bulk was a profound, animal comfort. His hands, stiff at first, gradually remembered the deftness, the rhythmic ping, 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 of warm milk striking the cold pail, echoing strangely sharp in the frozen silence. The milk steamed faintly in the frigid air as he carried the pail back, the liquid already beginning to chill. Straining, it felt urgent. Back inside, the fire's warmth was a tangible embrace. The pail and strainer were scrubbed immediately with icy water from the pitcher, the grease requiring extra sand. The used water trough was a solid block of ice again, thicker than yesterday. Breaking it required vigorous, jarring blows with the boot heel and hay fork handle, the ice shattering with loud reports that echoed across the muffled fields. Refilling the trough was a slow process of multiple trips with the heavy bucket, the well crank protesting shrilly, the rope rough and cold. Their hay was replenished, the animals moving slowly in the deep cold. The vegetable garden was a featureless white expanse, only the faintest suggestion of mounds hinting at buried cabbages. Hubert stood once more at the boundary, hands thrust deep into pockets, surveying the monochrome stillness. The silence was immense, a weight pressing down, broken only by the distant, solitary caw of a rook that sounded impossibly lonely against the vast, frozen silence. The routines, though slowed and hardened by the cold, held firm. Chapter 23. The return to the cottage's relative warmth was a relief that settled deep into Hubert's bones. He removed the snow-laden outer layers, hanging them to dry and thaw slowly by the hearth, steam rising faintly from the felt hat's brim. The fire, banked earlier, needed only a small log added to maintain its steady glow. Hubert settled onto the low stool, the familiar contours a comfort. The knitting basket beckoned, lifting the nearly completed grey sock. The bone needles felt reassuringly solid in his cold stiffened fingers. He resumed knitting. The rhythm began, click, 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 a soft, insistent counterpoint to the crackle of the fire and the profound silence outside. The toe decreases continued, the dense ribbing narrowing steadily towards its conclusion. Each stitch was formed with meticulous care, the grey wool passing smoothly through his hands, the fabric growing denser, warmer. His gaze drifted to the fire, watching the flames consume the new log, their light flickering on the thick frost covering the inside of the window pane, creating shifting patterns of shadow and wheat gold. The world beyond was reduced to a blur of white through the ice. Time lost meaning, measured only in the incremental shortening of the sock's toe and the slow, steady diminishment of the wool ball in the basket. The cold remained a subtle presence, a tightening of the air at his back, held firmly at bay by the hearth's radiant circle. Hubert knitted on, his posture unchanging, his breathing slow and even, a statue of quiet industry in the frozen heart of the landscape. The clicking needles were the only testament to the passage of time within the snowbound cottage, a tiny, persistent heartbeat against the vast, white silence. Chapter 24. The grey light through the frost-thickened window deepened towards the muted bronze of late afternoon, though the snowscape outside offered no true sunset, only a gradual dimming of the flat, reflected glare. Hubert secured the final stitch of the sock's toe, a simple, seamless graft executed with the deftness of decades of practice. He snipped the yarn with the small, sharp knife from his pouch, threaded the end through the last loop, and pulled it tight. The sock was complete. He held it up in the firelight, a dense, tube-like thing of deep grey ribbing, utterly plain, devoid of ornament, yet radiating a palpable solidity and warmth. It joined its twin in the basket, a matched pair ready for the deepening winter. A small sense of completion, quiet and profound, settled within him. He placed the basket aside. The fire required attention for the evening. He added 2 smaller logs, mindful of the visible depletion of the woodpile stacked against the wall, and used the bellows briefly to encourage a steady flame suitable for cooking. The supper ritual commenced. Rising stiffly, he moved to the larder, its earthy coolness biting after the hearth's warmth. The earthenware crock was icy, skimming the cream felt like chipping ice, the layer thick but resistant. The skimmed milk beneath looked thin and grey-blue. He poured it into the heavy pot, placing it near the hearth. The sack of dried peas yielded its last measurable portion, the hard pellets rattling like tiny stones into the soaking bowl. Cold water covered them. The bread was gone save for a hardened crust too thick to saw. Supper would be peas pudding alone tonight. The iron pot was positioned over the low flames. The soaked peas, drained of their icy water, the splash outside freezing instantly, were added to the warming milk with salt and the final, small knob of hard butter. Hubert took up the wooden spoon, beginning the slow, constant stirring. The mixture thickened reluctantly in the reduced heat, bubbling infrequently, steam rising in thin, listless tendrils smelling of earth and warmth. Outside, the world sank into the deep blue-gray of snow twilight, utterly silent, utterly still. Inside, the scrape of the spoon and the fire's whisper were the only sounds accompanying Hubert's patient vigil over the simmering pot. The completed socks a small, silent testament to time endured in the frozen heart of Upper Thistledown. Chapter 25. The peas pudding achieved a thick, grainy consistency. Hubert spooned a large mound onto the trencher, the pale yellow paste steaming faintly in the firelit gloom. He sat at the small table, the completed socks resting in their basket nearby like dormant grey creatures. He ate slowly, methodically, each spoonful of the bland, hot paste a necessary fuel against the cold that seeped persistently through the stone walls. The silence within was absolute, profound, broken only by the scrape of the spoon and the soft, rhythmic sound of his chewing. Outside, the darkness was complete, a velvet blackness unrelieved by moon or stars, the snow absorbing all light and sound. Upper Thistledown existed only as a memory beneath the frozen shroud. Finishing the meal, he washed the trencher and spoon with cold water, the harsh soap lifting the last traces of paste. The dirty water, carried outside, hit the snow with a muffled thump and froze almost instantly. Banking the fire was an act of profound care. He raked the embers into the smallest, tightest possible mound, covered them completely with a deep, insulating layer of fine ash, burying every spark of precious warmth deep within the hearth. Stones, the single tallow candle's flame gutted wildly as he lit it, casting frantic, leaping shadows before settling into a small, steady burn. He carried it to the chest. Undressing was swift, efficient, each layer removed adding to the chill until he stood clad only in his nightshirt. His shadow loomed monstrously on the wall as he paused before the banked hearth. A single puff extinguished the candle. Darkness, thick and absolute, swallowed the cottage whole. Only the faintest, deepest red glow, like a single coal viewed from leagues away, hinted at the heat preserved deep within the ash. Navigating by touch and memory, Hubert found his palate. The straw crackled like dry bones as he lowered himself. He burrowed deep beneath the heavy blankets, pulling them over his head, tucking the edges fiercely, creating a small, dark cave of wool against the world. Lying curled on his side, knees drawn up, he listened to the immense silence. The cold pressed in, a tangible force. His breath, warm and moist within the blankets, formed condensation on the wool near his face. Sleep came slowly, a hard-won retreat into unconsciousness, while outside, under the starless vault of the frozen sky, the silence of Upper Thistledown deepened, absolute and eternal, broken only by the imperceptible settling of snow upon snow. Chapter 26. The deep cold persisted through the night, pressing against the cottage walls with silent, relentless intensity. Hubert awoke to find his breath had frozen on the wool blankets near his face, forming a brittle crust of ice that crackled faintly as he shifted. The darkness was absolute, thick as pitch, the banked fire offering no glow whatsoever through the ash mound, a first in all his winters at Upper Thistledown. He lay motionless, listening to the profound silence, a silence so complete it seemed to hum in his ears, broken only by the faint, high-pitched creak of the cottage timbers contracting further in the cold. Pushing back the blankets was an act of will, the frigid air striking like a physical blow. Dressing was a hurried affair, fingers fumbling with buttons, the fabric of his clothes stiff with residual dampness and cold. The tinderbox felt like a block of ice in his hands, striking flint against steel produced weak, reluctant sparks that died instantly on the frost-laden tinder. It took a dozen attempts before a spark caught. The the tiny flame so fragile he had to cradle it in his cupped palms, breathing on it with the shallowest exhalations to avoid extinguishing it, feeding it the finest, driest twigs one by one. The process consumed nearly an hour before a sustainable flame took hold in the hearth. The kettle, filled with water that had skimmed over with ice overnight, took an eternity to boil. The porridge, when finally prepared, was thinner than usual, the last of the oats stretched with extra water. He ate it slowly, savoring the scant warmth it provided, his gaze fixed on the feeble fire, willing it to grow stronger. Outside, the world remained locked in frozen stasis, the snowdrifts higher against the cottage walls, the sky a flat, featureless grey that promised neither relief nor further torment, just endless, unyielding cold. Chapter 27. The morning chores were a battle against the elements, each step a laborious crunch through knee-deep snow that had drifted against the byre door. Daisy lowed plaintively, her breath steaming in thick clouds, her flanks dusted with frost. The milking process was slow, his stiff fingers struggling with the usual deftness, the milk freezing at the edges of the pail before he could carry it back to the cottage. The ewes huddled together for warmth, their water trough frozen solid again, requiring another brutal session of ice-breaking with the hay. Fork's handle, the woodpile, once a reassuringly dense stack against the back wall, now showed alarming gaps, the remaining logs needing to be rationed carefully. Hubert split a few pieces of reserve kindling with the hatchet, the strikes echoing dully in the muffled air, the brittle wood splintering reluctantly. Indoors, he resumed his place by the fire, the knitting basket empty now, leaving him with idle hands. He retrieved a worn whetstone from the tool pouch and began methodically sharpening every blade he owned, the bone-handled knife, the hatchet, the awl, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filling the quiet cottage, a practical meditation against the cold's encroaching grip. The light outside never brightened beyond a dull pewter glow, the days shortened to mere hours of twilight by the oppressive cloud cover. Time became meaningless, measured only in logs consumed and chores completed. The world beyond Upper Thistledown reduced to a frozen myth, forgotten beneath the snow's smothering weight. Chapter 28. A change came in the night, not warmth, but a subtle shift in the air's texture, a creeping dampness that seeped into the cottage despite the banked fire. Hubert awoke to the unfamiliar sound of dripping, the eaves shedding their burden of ice in slow, irregular droplets that struck the frozen ground outside with soft, hollow taps. The cold remained brutal, but the sky had darkened further, heavy with the promise of snow. By midday, it began, not the gentle flakes of before, but a driving, wind-whipped storm that scoured the landscape, piling snow against the cottage walls in sculpted drifts, hissing as it struck the thatch. Hubert barred the door against the building storm, the wind's moan rising to a shriek around the eaves, the fire flickering wildly despite the chimney's draw. He huddled closer to the hearth, the last reserves of firewood stacked within arm's reach, feeding the flames just enough to maintain a defensive circle of warmth. The cottage groaned under the wind's assault, the timbers creaking like a ship at sea. The storm's fury mounted as darkness fell, snow finding its way through invisible chinks in the thatch, landing with faint hisses on the hearthstones. Hubert sat wrapped in his thickest blanket, the fire's light the only bulwark against the howling dark, the storm's voice drowning all other sounds, the relentless scream of wind, the rattle of the shutters, the ominous creak of overburdened branches beyond the walls. Sleep was impossible. He remained awake through the long night, the fire his sole companion, its flickering light the only proof that the world beyond the storm still existed at all. Chapter 29. Dawn revealed the storm's aftermath, a world remade yet again, the snow piled in sweeping, sculpted dunes that buried fences and hedges, the lane to the village utterly erased. The sky had cleared, leaving a pale, brittle blue and a cold so sharp it burned the lungs with each breath. Hubert dug his way to the byre, the snow collapsing in powdery waves around his boots, the drifts reaching his thighs in places. Daisy greeted him with a plaintive moo, her water bucket frozen solid, her hay dusted with snow that had sifted through the roof's cracks. The milking was a hurried affair, his fingers aching anew with the cold, the milk freezing in the pail before he could strain it. The ewes were buried in their shelter, only their noses visible beneath the thick blanket of snow. Digging them out left him sweating beneath his layers, the dampness chilling him dangerously as soon as he stopped moving. The woodpile was now critically low, forcing him to venture into the orchard to gather fallen branches buried beneath the snow, their weight testing his endurance as he dragged them back to the cottage. Indoors, he stoked the fire with precious logs, the warmth a fleeting comfort against the deep, bone-numbing cold that had settled into his joints. The knitting basket remained empty, the socks completed. Instead, he turned to mending his moleskin jacket, the elbows worn thin, stitching patches with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and cold. The light outside was blinding, the snow reflecting the pale sun with a glare that made his eyes water. Upper Thistledown lay buried, silent, a frozen wasteland where only the hardiest creatures, men like Hubert, beasts like Daisy, endured through sheer, dumb persistence, the rhythms of life reduced to the barest essentials: warmth, food, survival. Chapter 30. The cold broke on the 5th day, not with a thaw but with a subtle lessening of its grip, the temperature rising just enough to turn the air from knife-edge to merely bitter. Hubert noticed it first in the byre, where Daisy's breath no longer hung in thick clouds, and in the ewe's water trough, where the ice was thinner, breaking apart with less effort. The sky remained a flat, featureless grey, but the wind had died, leaving a stillness that felt almost warm by comparison. He took advantage of the slight reprieve to venture further afield, snowshoes fashioned from willow withes and leather straps allowing him to traverse the deep drifts to the woodpile behind the barn, where he split and hauled back as much fuel as his aching muscles could manage. The exertion left him sweating beneath his layers, a dangerous dampness that chilled him the moment he paused. Indoors, he stoked the fire higher than usual, the luxury of heat a fleeting indulgence against the knowledge that winter's heart still gripped the land. Supper was the last of the pease pudding, stretched with extra water and a handful of grain scavenged from the bottom of the oat sack. He ate it slowly, savoring each bland mouthful, his gaze fixed on the flames, their light the only brightness in a world gone monochrome with cold. Outside, the silence of Upper Thistledown deepened as night fell, the snow absorbing all sound, the stars emerging at last in a glittering, frozen tapestry overhead, countless, distant, indifferent to the small, stubborn life persisting beneath them in a stone cottage with a single smoking chimney, where Hubert Gableby banked the fire once more and prepared to endure another long, silent night at the edge of the frozen world. Chapter 31. The slight reprieve from the brutal cold was short-lived. By the next morning, the temperature plunged again, seizing the landscape in an iron grip. The snow, softened briefly by the marginal rise in warmth, had refrozen into a crust hard enough to bear Hubert's weight without breaking, though each step sent a brittle echo across the fields. The sky hung low and leaden, pressing down on the world with the weight of unmoving air. Inside the cottage, the fire, though diligently fed, struggled against the pervasive chill that seeped through the stone walls like an insidious tide. Hubert moved through his routines with mechanical precision, kettle boiling, porridge thickening, bread toasted to a hard, dark brown, but every action felt slower, heavier, as if the cold had thickened his blood. His fingers, though wrapped in layers of wool, ached with a dull, persistent throb, the joints stiffening further with each exposure to the frigid air outside. The byre was a haven of comparative warmth, Daisy's bulk radiating heat, her breath fogging the still air as she turned her great head to watch him enter. The milking was a quiet, rhythmic task, the ping asterisk of milk in the pail steady and reassuring, though the liquid skimmed over with ice before he could carry it back to the cottage. The ewes, their thick winter coats matted with frost, huddled together in their shelter, their water trough frozen solid once more. Breaking the ice was a task that sent jolts of pain up his arms with each strike of the hay fork's handle, the sound sharp and solitary in the muffled silence. By midday, the sky darkened further, the flat grey giving way to a deeper, more ominous slate. The air grew still, unnaturally so, as if the world were holding its breath. Hubert, sensing the shift, hauled extra wood inside, stacking it carefully by the hearth, knowing what was coming. The storm arrived without preamble, a sudden, howling gust that rattled the shutters and sent a fine spray of snow hissing down the chimney, making the fire sputter and cough. Within minutes, the world beyond the cottage windows vanished behind a swirling white curtain, the wind's voice rising to a shriek that drowned out all other sound. Hubert barred the door, though he knew it was futile against the cold's relentless assault. The cottage groaned under the wind's battering, the timbers creaking like the hull of a ship in a gale. Drafts knifed through invisible gaps in the thatch, extinguishing candles and making the fire flicker wildly. He huddled closer to the hearth, feeding it precious logs one at a time, the flames his only defense against the storm's fury. The light flickered and danced, casting monstrous, wavering shadows on the walls, the only movement in a world otherwise reduced to howling wind and driving snow. Nightfall brought no relief. The storm raged on, the wind's voice shifting from a shriek to a deep, resonant moan that seemed to vibrate through the cottage's very stones. Snow piled against the walls, the weight of it pressing inward, as if the earth itself sought to reclaim the small human intrusion. Hubert dozed fitfully by the fire, wrapped in every blanket he owned, waking often to feed the flames or to listen to the storm's unrelenting voice. The cold was a living thing, creeping closer each time the fire waned, its fingers probing for weakness. He dreamed, in those half-waking moments, of summers long past, the scent of sun-warmed grass, the drone of bees in the orchard, the heavy, golden light of late afternoon, but each time he surfaced fully, it was to the same reality, the fire's glow, the wind's scream, the endless, implacable cold. Dawn, when it came, was a feeble thing. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving behind a world buried under drifts taller than a man. The sky was clear, the air so still and cold it burned the lungs. Hubert dug his way out of the cottage, the snow collapsing in great, powdery waves around him. The village, if it still existed, was invisible beneath the white expanse. The byre was half buried, the ewes' shelter completely submerged. Digging him out left him drenched in sweat, the dampness freezing almost instantly when he paused to breathe. Daisy, at least, was unharmed, her great dark eye watching him with bovine patience as he forked fresh hay into her manger. The woodpile was now a mere scattering of split logs beneath the snow, barely enough for another day. He hauled what he could back to the cottage, his arms trembling with exhaustion. Inside, he stoked the fire with the last of the dry wood, the flames leaping hungrily. The cottage warmed slowly, the heat a feeble thing against the cold's entrenched grip. Supper was a thin broth made from the last of the stored onions and a handful of grain, its meager warmth a fleeting comfort. Outside, the stars emerged, sharp and pitiless in the frozen sky. Hubert sat by the fire, his hands outstretched to the flames, and waited. There was nothing else to do. The cold had won. All that remained was to endure it. Chapter 31. The slight reprieve from the brutal cold was short-lived, as by the next morning the temperature plunged again, seizing the landscape in an iron grip where the snow, softened briefly by the marginal rise in warmth, had refrozen into a crust hard enough to bear Hubert's weight without breaking, though each step sent a brittle echo across the fields while the sky hung low and leaden, pressing down on the world with the weight of unmoving air as inside the cottage the fire, though diligently fed, struggled against the pervasive chill that seeped through the stone walls like an insidious tide, with Hubert moving through his routines with mechanical precision, kettle boiling, porridge thickening, bread toasted to a hard, dark brown, but every action felt slower, heavier, as if the cold had thickened his blood where his fingers, though wrapped in layers of wool, ached with a dull, persistent throb, the joints stiffening further with each exposure to the frigid air outside when the byre proved a haven of comparative warmth, Daisy's bulk radiating heat, her breath fogging the still air as she turned her great head to watch him enter where the milking became a quiet, rhythmic task, the ping of milk in the pail steady and reassuring though the liquid skimmed over with ice before he could carry it back to the cottage, while the ewes, their thick winter coats matted with frost, huddled together in their shelter, their water trough frozen solid once more as breaking the ice became a task that sent jolts of pain up his arms with each strike of the hay fork's handle, the sound sharp and solitary in the muffled silence until by midday the sky darkened further, the flat grey giving way to a deeper, more ominous slate where the air grew still, unnaturally so, as if the world were holding its breath when Hubert, sensing the shift, hauled extra wood inside, stacking it carefully by the hearth, knowing what was coming as the storm arrived without preamble, a sudden, howling gust that rattled the shutters and sent a fine spray of snow hissing down the chimney, making the fire sputter and cough where within minutes the world beyond the cottage windows vanished behind a swirling white curtain, the wind's voice rising to a shriek that drowned out all other sound while Hubert barred the door, though he knew it was futile against the cold's relentless assault as the cottage groaned under the wind's battering, the timbers creaking like the hull of a ship in a gale with drafts knifing through invisible gaps in the thatch, extinguishing candles and making the fire flicker wildly when he huddled closer to the hearth, feeding it precious logs one at a time, the flames his only defense against the storm's fury where the light flickered and danced, casting monstrous, wavering shadows on the walls, the only movement in a world otherwise reduced to howling wind and driving snow until nightfall brought no relief as the storm raged on, the wind's voice shifting from a shriek to a deep, resonant moan that seemed to vibrate through the cottage's very stones while snow piled against the walls, the weight of it pressing inward, as if the earth itself sought to reclaim the small human intrusion where Hubert dozed fitfully by the fire, wrapped in every blanket he owned, waking often to feed the flames or to listen to the storm's unrelenting voice while the cold became a living thing, creeping closer each time the fire waned, its fingers probing for weakness when he dreamed, in those half-waking moments, of summers long past, the scent of sun-warmed grass, the drone of bees in the orchard, the heavy, golden light of late afternoon, but each time he surfaced fully, it was to the same reality, the fire's glow, the wind's scream, the endless, implacable cold until dawn, when it came, was a feeble thing. Where the storm had spent itself in the night, leaving behind a world buried under drifts taller than a man with the sky clear, the air so still and cold it burned the lungs when Hubert dug his way out of the cottage, the snow collapsing in great, powdery waves around him while the village, if it still existed, was invisible beneath the white expanse as the byre was half buried, the youth's shelter completely submerged where digging him out left him drenched in sweat, the dampness freezing almost instantly when he paused to breathe while Daisy, at least, was unharmed, her great dark eye watching him with bovine patience as he forked fresh hay into her manger when the woodpile became a mere scattering of split logs beneath the snow, barely enough for another day as he hauled what he could back to the cottage, his arms trembling with exhaustion until inside, he stoked the fire with the last of the dry wood, the flames leaping hungrily where the cottage warmed slowly, the heat a feeble thing against the cold's entrenched grip while supper became a thin broth made from the last of the stored onions and a handful of grain, its meager warmth a fleeting comfort as outside, the stars emerged, sharp and pitiless in the frozen sky when Hubert sat by the fire, his hands outstretched to the flames, and waited where there was nothing else to do as the cold had won where all that remained was to endure it. Chapter 32. The cold settled into Hubert's bones like an uninvited tenant, refusing to be evicted no matter how close he huddled to the fire's meager glow. The last log had burned down to embers hours ago, leaving only a faint orange pulse beneath the ashes that he guarded jealously, scraping together every stray twig and scrap of dried moss to keep some semblance of warmth alive. His breath hung frozen in the air before him, each exhalation a visible reminder of the cottage's failing heat. Outside, the snow had crusted over with an icy shell that glittered maliciously under the pale winter sun, the drift swallowing the stone walls up to the windowsills where frost flowers bloomed across the glass in delicate, knife-edged patterns. The silence was absolute, no wind stirred the frozen landscape, no birds called from the bare-limbed orchard trees, not even the creak of settling timber disturbed the heavy quiet. Hubert's stomach growled insistently, but the grain sack hung limp and empty from its hook, the last of the onions reduced to papery skins in the bottom of the storage bin. He stirred the ashes with an iron poker, coaxing forth a few reluctant sparks that died almost immediately in the frigid air. The thought of venturing out to the buried root cellar flickered through his mind, but the memory of yesterday's exhausting battle with the snowdrifts made his aching muscles protest at the mere idea. Daisy would need tending soon regardless, her mournful lowing would start any moment, a sound that carried through the thick stone walls with surprising clarity. Hubert flexed his stiff fingers before plunging them into his armpits for warmth, his yellowed nails tinged blue at the quick. The cold had a way of magnifying every small discomfort. The rough wool of his stockings chafed where they'd worn thin at the heels, his left knee throbbed with a dull persistence from an old injury, and his lips had cracked in several places despite his constant licking. Time stretched oddly in this frozen limbo, the usual markers of day and night blurred by the unrelenting grey sky and the snow's eerie luminosity after dark. Hubert found himself remembering the summer kitchen garden with near hallucinatory clarity, the weight of sun-warmed tomatoes in his palm, the earthy scent of turned soil, the drone of contented bees moving between the bean flowers. The memories were so vivid he could almost feel the heat of the sun on his neck, making the present cold seem all the more cruel by comparison. A sudden noise from the byre startled him from his reverie, Daisy's impatient hoof striking the stone floor. Hubert sighed, watching his breath plume before him, then reached for his frozen boots where they sat by the dead hearth, their leather stiff as wood. The laces resisted his numb fingers, the simple knot suddenly as complex as a shipwright's rigging. Somewhere beyond the cottage walls, a tree branch snapped under the weight of ice, the report sharp as a musket shot in the crystalline air. Hubert paused, listening to the echoes fade across the frozen fields, then bent once more to his task, his movements slow and deliberate like a man moving through deep water. The cold had stolen all urgency from the world, reducing existence to its most basic elements, warmth and its absence, hunger and its satisfaction, light and its disappearance. There would be no reprieve today, nor likely tomorrow. There was only endurance, the slow accumulation of minutes into hours, the patient waiting for the earth to remember it was meant to turn toward the sun again. Hubert finally worked the knot free and tugged the boots onto his aching feet, the leather biting into his swollen ankles. Daisy called again, her voice muffled by the thick walls but unmistakable in its demand. Hubert reached for his heavy coat, its familiar weight now a burden rather than comfort, and prepared to face the frozen world once more. Chapter 33. The cold gnawed at Hubert's fingertips as he stepped into the frozen stillness of the morning, his breath pluming in thick white clouds before dissipating into the brittle air. The snow had crusted overnight into an unyielding shell, crunching underfoot like shattered glass with each laborious step toward the byre. Daisy greeted him with a low, plaintive moo, her breath frosting the air as she turned her great head toward him, dark eyes reflecting the pale light filtering through the cracks in the stone walls. The milking stool was ice-cold beneath him, the pail's rim already rimmed with frost as he positioned it beneath her udder. His hands, stiff and aching, moved with mechanical slowness, the rhythmic ping asterisk of milk against metal a fragile counterpoint to the vast silence pressing in from outside. The liquid steamed faintly in the frigid air, but by the time he carried the pail back to the cottage, a thin skin of ice had already formed across its surface. The ewes, buried in their shelter, barely stirred as he broke the ice in their trough again, the sharp cracks echoing across the frozen fields like gunshots. The woodpile was nearly gone, reduced to a few gnarled chunks of oak that resisted the hatchet's blade with stubborn defiance. Each strike sent jolts of pain up his arms, the vibrations lingering in his bones long after the last log had been split. Chapter 34. The fire, though fed with precious fuel, struggled against the cold's relentless siege, its heat barely enough to ward off the worst of the chill that seeped through the cottage's stone walls. Hubert sat hunched on the low stool, his hands outstretched toward the flames, the skin reddened and cracked from exposure. The porridge in the pot bubbled sluggishly, its usual hearty thickness reduced to a watery gruel by the last handful of oats stretched too far. He ate it slowly, savoring each lukewarm spoonful, the taste bland and unremarkable but vital nonetheless. Outside, the light was flat and grey, the sun a pale, distant smudge behind the clouds, offering no warmth, only a feeble illumination that did little to dispel the gloom. The knitting basket sat untouched, there was no wool left to spin, no projects to complete, only the endless wait for winter's grip to loosen. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the cottage timbers or the soft hiss of a damp log in the fire. Hubert's thoughts drifted, unmoored by the monotony, settling on memories of summers past, the scent of hay drying in the fields, the hum of bees in the clover, the weight of a ripe apple in his palm. But the memories were fleeting, dissolving like mist as the cold reasserted itself, dragging him back to the present, to the unyielding reality of frost and hunger and stillness. Chapter 35. The storm returned in the night, howling down from the north with a fury that shook the cottage to its foundations. Snow hissed against the thatch, finding every gap and crevice, dusting the floor with fine, icy powder. Hubert woke to a darkness so complete it felt suffocating, the fire long dead, the air thick with cold. He fumbled for the tinderbox, his fingers clumsy with numbness, the flint striking uselessly against the steel in the blackness. It took an eternity to coax a spark to life, the tiny flame trembling in his cupped hands as he fed it slivers of kindling, each breath held lest he extinguish it. The fire's rebirth was a fragile victory, the flames struggling against the draughts that knifed through the room, their light feeble against the storm's wrath. The wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the shutters, driving snow beneath the door in glittering arcs. Hubert huddled closer to the hearth, wrapped in every blanket he owned, the wool scratchy against his skin, the cold a constant, gnawing presence at his back. Time lost meaning, there was only the fire's flicker, the storm's unrelenting voice, and the slow, creeping dread that winter might never end. Chapter 36. Dawn brought no reprieve. The storm had scoured the landscape clean, piling snow in drifts that swallowed the cottage up to the eaves. Hubert dug his way out with numb hands, the snow collapsing around him in powdery waves, the effort leaving him gasping, his muscles burning. The byre was buried, only the peak of its roof visible above the white expanse. Daisy's muffled lowing guided him as he tunneled through the drift blocking the door, the icy particles stinging his face like needles. Inside, the cow stood patient and weary, her flanks dusted with snow that had sifted through the thatch. The milking was a hurried affair, his fingers too stiff to work with the usual efficiency, the milk freezing in the pail before he could strain it. The ewes were silent, buried somewhere beneath the snow, their fate uncertain. The woodpile was gone, fully claimed by the storm, leaving only a few scattered branches to scavenge. Hubert hauled them back to the cottage, his breath ragged, his body protesting every movement. The fire, when rebuilt, was a pitiful thing, its heat barely enough to thaw his frozen hands, let alone warm the room. Supper was a handful of grain soaked in hot water, a meager imitation of porridge that did little to fill the hollow ache in his stomach. The cold had won, there was no denying it now. All that remained was to endure. Chapter 37. The cold was a living thing, coiled in the cottage's corners, pressing against Hubert's skin like a weight. The fire, though fed with the last of the wood, could do no more than hold it at bay, the circle of warmth shrinking with each passing hour. Hubert sat motionless on the stool, his hands limp in his lap, his breath shallow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional crackle of the flames or the soft sigh of settling ash. Outside, the world was frozen in time, the snow unmoving, the sky a featureless grey. Hunger gnawed at him, a constant, dull ache that had long since ceased to be sharp, blending into the background of discomfort. His thoughts were slow, syrupy, drifting like snowflakes, memories of warmth, of food, of light, all distant and untouchable. Daisy's lowing had stopped hours ago, the silence from the byre more ominous than any sound. The cold had taken everything, the animals, the fire, the will to move. Hubert's eyelids grew heavy, the fire's glow dimming in his vision as the cold crept closer, its fingers brushing his skin. There was no fear, only a quiet acceptance, a surrender to the inevitable. The last ember flickered, then died, the darkness rushing in to claim the cottage, the cold settling over everything like a shroud. Winter, at last, had won. Chapter 38. The silence was absolute, thick as wool packed into the ears, pressing against Hubert's consciousness like a physical weight. Somewhere beyond the frozen walls of the cottage, a branch cracked under the burden of ice, the sharp report echoing across the snow-blanketed fields before being swallowed by the all-consuming stillness. Hubert stirred from his stupor, blinking crusted eyes against the dim light filtering through the ice-encrusted window. His breath came in shallow puffs of vapor, each exhalation a visible testament to the life still stubbornly clinging to his gaunt frame. The hearth lay cold and dead, its ashes long since devoid of even memory's warmth. With movements as slow and deliberate as a man moving through deep water, Hubert pushed himself upright, his joints protesting with sharp stabs of pain that radiated up his spine and through his frozen limbs. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the sound unnaturally loud in the tomb-like quiet of the cottage. His stomach growled, an empty, aching thing that had long since passed beyond hunger into a dull, constant gnawing. The grain sack hung limp and empty from its hook, its rough weave dusted with frost. Outside, the world remained frozen in time, the snowdrifts piled high against the walls, their smooth surfaces undisturbed by any living thing. The cold had seeped into everything, into the stones of the cottage, into the marrow of Hubert's bones, into the very air he breathed. It was a cold that went beyond mere temperature, beyond winter's ordinary bite. This was the cold of abandonment, of a world that had forgotten warmth entirely. Chapter 39. The thought of Daisy pulled at him, a nagging worry that cut through the fog of cold and hunger. Hubert dragged his stiff limbs toward the door, his fingers fumbling with the latch, the metal so cold it burned his skin. The snow had drifted high against the entrance, packing itself into an unyielding wall that resisted his first weak pushes. Setting his shoulder against the wood, he shoved with what little strength remained, the door inching open with a protesting groan, sending a cascade of powdery snow tumbling across the threshold. The light outside was flat and grey, the sky a seamless sheet of cloud that offered no hint of sun or respite. The path to the byre was gone, buried beneath feet of snow, but Hubert staggered forward anyway, his legs sinking knee-deep with each step, the effort dragging whimpers of exhaustion from his chapped lips. The byre door was frozen shut, its outline barely visible beneath the smooth curves of wind-sculpted snow. He scraped at it with bare hands, the ice tearing at his already raw skin, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his lungs. When the door finally gave way, the darkness within was absolute, the air thick with the stench of manure and the ominous silence of an empty stall. Daisy was gone. Whether she had broken free in search of food or succumbed to the cold, there was no sign. Only her absence, and the hollow echo of Hubert's own labored breathing in the empty space where life had once been. Chapter 40. The walk back to the cottage was a blur of white pain and creeping numbness. Hubert moved like a man already dead, his body operating on some primal instinct that refused to acknowledge defeat even as his mind whispered surrender. The cottage doorway yawned black before him, the interior no warmer than the frozen wilderness outside, but offering at least the illusion of shelter. He collapsed just inside the threshold, his legs giving way at last, his hands splayed against the packed earth floor that was as cold as the grave. The silence pressed in around him, heavier now, more final. There were no more chores to complete, no more animals to tend, no more fuel to gather. There was only the waiting, the slow, inevitable winding down of a life that had once been measured in seasons and harvests and the turning of the earth. Hubert's breath came slower now, the plumes of vapor growing fainter with each exhalation. His eyelids drooped, the cold no longer biting but almost comfortable, like a heavy blanket drawing him down into sleep. Somewhere beyond the walls of the cottage, beyond the frozen fields and ice-laden trees, a single rook cawed, its voice sharp and clear in the crystalline air. Hubert's fingers twitched against the floor, as if to grasp at something, a memory of warmth, perhaps, or the ghost of a summer long past. The light through the ice-covered window dimmed further, the grey of late afternoon deepening toward twilight. The cold settled into his bones, into his blood, into the chambers of his heart, and at last, mercifully, the silence was complete. Chapter 41. The thaw came weeks later, creeping in on the heels of a southern wind that carried with it the scent of damp earth and the promise of green things stirring beneath the snow. The drifts shrank daily, revealing the frozen ground beneath, the stiff corpses of winter-killed grasses poking through the melting white. The lane to Upper Thistledown reappeared, a muddy track rutted by the first cart wheels to brave its length. In the cottage, the ice on the window panes melted at last, running in slow, meandering rivulets down the glass to pool on the sill. The hearth remained cold, its ashes undisturbed by any living hand. The knitting basket sat where it had been left, the completed grey socks folded neatly within, waiting for a winter that would never come. Outside, the ewes emerged from their shelter, gaunt and hollow-flanked but alive, their hooves leaving sharp prints in the softening earth. The orchard trees shook off the burden of ice, their black branches stretching toward the pale sun like fingers unclenching after a long fist. Life went on, as it always had and always would, the wheel of the seasons turning inexorably toward spring. But in the cottage by the lane, in the chair by the cold hearth, Hubert Gableby sat still and silent, his work done at last, his face peaceful in the way of those who have finally, blessedly, found rest. The cold had taken him, as it takes all things in the end, but the quiet dignity of his passing was its own kind of victory, a man who had lived as he chose, in rhythm with the earth, until the earth claimed him back. And overhead, unseen but felt in the softening air and the songs of returning birds, the great wheel turned on, carrying with it the memory of winters past and the promise of winters yet to come. Chapter 42. The first villagers to come calling found the cottage just as winter had left it, the door ajar, the interior still carrying the chill of the departed season. They stood in respectful silence just inside the threshold, their hats clutched in work-roughened hands, their breath mingling in the air before them. No one spoke of the cold, or of the hunger that must have come before it. These were things they all understood, things woven into the fabric of their lives just as surely as the turning of the seasons. They buried Hubert in the churchyard beside his parents, the earth still half frozen but yielding enough to accept him. The vicar spoke the old words, his voice carrying on the spring breeze that stirred the bare branches of the yew trees. Afterward, the villagers returned to their homes and their fields and the business of living, as country people must always do. The cottage stood empty for a time, its hearth cold, its walls echoing with memories. Then, as spring deepened and the first green shoots pushed through the thawed earth, a young couple from the next village over came to look at the small holding. They walked the boundaries together, the woman's hand resting lightly on the swell of her belly, the man testing the solidity of the fences and the richness of the soil. They spoke in low voices of apple trees and sheep, of winters past and winters yet to come. And high above, a single rook circled on the warming air, its shadow passing fleetingly over the cottage roof where new thatch would soon be laid, over the fields where new crops would soon be planted, over the quiet grave where Hubert Gableby slept at last, his long vigil over. The wheel had turned. Life went on. Chapter 43. The last turning of the earth. The first spring lambs wobbled on unsteady legs in the pasture behind the cottage where the young couple had settled, their bleating cries carrying across fields no longer choked with snow but thick with new grass. The woman knelt in the kitchen garden, her fingers pressing seeds into the thawed earth, peas and beans and the first early potatoes, just as Hubert had done for decades before her. Inside the cottage, the hearth crackled with a lively fire, its light dancing across walls scrubbed clean of winter's gloom. The man repaired the wicker garden edging, hammering new stakes into the soft ground, his movements sure and purposeful. The grey wool socks, discovered folded neatly in the knitting basket, now warmed the feet of the village midwife, gifted to her for the long nights she spent walking between birthing beds. Daisy, it turned out, had not perished. She'd been found 2 farms over, sheltered in a neighbor's barn, her sides gaunt but her eyes bright. She lowed now in the rebuilt byre, her milk rich with the taste of fresh clover. The old apple trees, their gnarled branches studded with tight pink buds, stood sentinel over it all, the turning of seasons, the leaving and returning of life, the quiet persistence of things that endure. At dusk, when the chores were done and the cottage glowed warm against the violet twilight, the young couple sometimes spoke of the man who had lived there before. They wondered, idly, if he'd known the first crocuses would bloom yellow by the doorstep where he'd once scattered the ashes from his hearth. If he'd imagined lambs would someday bleat in the pasture where his ewes had huddled through the storm. They hoped, in their way, that he had, that in the last moments, when the cold pressed closest, he'd understood this truth, that winter never wins forever. Beyond the cottage lane, the road to Upper Thistledown curved past the churchyard, where Hubert's grave lay nestled between his parents' weathered stones. No grand marker proclaimed his name, only a simple slab of local rock, already wearing smooth under the gentle abrasion of rain and time. But in the village, in the fields, in the quiet rhythm of days measured by sun and soil rather than clocks, his legacy endured. The earth remembered, and when the first frost of the next autumn silvered the grass, and the villagers stacked their wood piles high against the coming cold, they did so without fear. For they knew, as all country people know, that winter is only a season. The fire always returns. The lambs always leap again, and the earth, in its infinite patience, turns on.